Chapter 89. Life Story. I couldn't help but glance over to the door after I heard Baihena's shout. Shaking my head, I stood up and went out of the room, leaving a confused Tara behind me. However, she didn't follow me, and simply laid back down on the bed for a nap. After leaving the room, I made my way to Baihena's door, and knocked on it once. Huh, Dale, that you? A surprised voice called out from within, moments before the door opened up to reveal a smiling human woman. Sorry, didn't mean to disturb you. No, it's all right. I shook my head. I was going to come by and talk to you once you were free either way. When I said that, she blinked in confusion, before taking a step back to let me in. Sure thing. What's on your mind? She asked, closing the door after I had entered. In Baihena's room, the only real furniture was the bed, so I simply leaned against the wall and watched her, my arms crossed in front of me. I wanted to talk to you about your life as a mortal, see if you had learned anything. I couldn't really ask Tara if she discovered anything new, since she wasn't really able to do that. Baihena. However, I could. She looked down, crossing her arms as well as she sank into thought. I guess I learned a bit more about key paths, if you want to hear that. Other than that, there wasn't really much new that I learned. I wasn't exactly able to move around how I wanted. She said with a bitter smile. Yeah, I saw that. I chuckled. So, what did you learn about key paths? Seeing my interest, Baihena smiled a bit more happily, moving over to sit cross-legged on her bed. Since my country specialized in monks and martial artists, we did quite a bit of experimenting with key paths. Most people weren't satisfied with the simple, circle path that was initially invented. As our research continued, we discovered a few things. If you have a key path moving through a certain part of your body, that body part will get a passive buff. For instance, someone who has it in their arms will become stronger as long as their ki isn't depleted. As she said that, Baihena closed her eyes, seeming to focus heavily on something. Next to her, a yellow liquid seemed to rise up from the bed, moving in spiraling lines as it began to create a shape. It did not take me too long to realize that the shape looked almost like a poorly drawn stick figure skeleton of Baihena herself. This is the kind of key path we eventually created, one that moves through the entire body. The effects are less noticeable like this, until the person using it gets enough ki to make a difference. For a normal person, they might experience a very small increase in strength and durability. However, for a trained monk, their strength could double, or even triple depending on their ki. She seemed a bit excited as she said that, causing me to nod my head in appreciation. My own ki couldn't be considered much unless I used my keeper levels, but if I did then this would be a big help to me. Though, I couldn't help but tease her slightly. And your son? I asked with a smirk, causing her face to flush for a moment. Please, don't joke about that. She replied with a dramatic sigh. I needed a way out. One of the perks of these key paths is that it nourishes the body. I might have been able to live for another century before dying of old age. So I found someone with an incurable disease, and had a kid with him. She looked away, almost shyly as she said that. Thankfully, I managed to get the disease myself, so I was able to arrange my incarnation's death. All I had to do was avoid leveling up for long enough that the disease could take root, and it was only a matter of time. She let out a breath of relief at the end of that, before looking up with a smile. I've got to thank that kid for letting me finally get out of being a queen. So that's why you made him king when you left. I nodded my head in understanding. However, a small question was nagging at me. Wouldn't leveling up remove the disease from you or your husband, though? As far as I knew, leveling up was a miracle cure for pretty much anything. Hearing that, Baihena shook her head. That's what I used to think too. You'd have to ask Tara to be sure, but from what I can tell that's not how it works. I accidentally leveled up a few weeks after getting the disease, and was fully healed. However, my health soon began to drop again as the symptoms came back. I can explain that. A voice came from the door, which I was surprised to find had suddenly opened. Ryan was standing there with a wide grin as she walked into the room. I've been paying a bit more attention to that, so I've gotten a few answers about how leveling up works. Baihena and I both blinked in surprise, though the human goddess seemed a bit annoyed that Ryan had suddenly barged into her room. The elf didn't seem to pay much mind, sitting on the bed next to Baihena's key path model. So, you want to hear it or not? Baihena let out a long sigh, waving her hand for Ryan to continue. Sweet. Love you too sis. Followed by a grumble of complaint from Baihena. Anyways, A few things have caught my attention with the elves as they leveled up. Sometimes, when they received stats for wisdom, intelligence, or charm, their ways of thinking will subtly change. Well, I did a bit of a test myself, and found out what was happening. Seeing that we had no intention of interrupting her, Ryan continued with a smile. Whenever someone gets a point in a physical stat, the world energies, as mortals call them, remodel the body. If it's in strength, their muscles might become slightly denser. If dexterity, their muscles and joints will be more flexible. Stamina increases the toughness of the skin and internal organs, as well as their immune systems. For mental stats, it's the brain that has changed. At that point, Ryan placed her hands down on the bed behind her, huffing slightly. I don't know enough about the brain to say exactly what is being done, but I can tell the end results. Intelligence increases their ability to remember things, wisdom helps them think more rationally, and charm helps them sympathize with the emotions of others. What about luck? I asked, since it was the only stat that she hadn't listed in her explanation. However, the answer that I got was a shake of her head. I can't really tell what luck does yet. There aren't many elves that train in classes that improve luck, only the merchants. That one you really will have to ask Tara to help you with. Okay, surely, you didn't come here just to barge into my room and give us an explanation of stats. Baihena asked, her brows knit together as she looked at the nearby goddess, who giggled in response. Of course not. I've got some rather important news for our dear keeper. She said with a grin, turning to look at me. I think I've found it. Everything we need for our bag of holding. Not only myself, even Baihena looked at her in shock when Ryan said that. Ever since my incarnation's parents let me start practicing magic, I've been quickly leveling up as a mage and enchanter. If I'm right, I should have all of the spell components needed for the bag. Thinking back to the spell iron blade that was still propped against my desk, I was obviously excited at the idea of being able to carry it with me whenever I descend. A weapon like that was more than enough for the current world to call a holy relic, something that would let anyone destroy an entire country on their own. Do you need any material components? Ryan nodded her head at that question. I can get Tubrok's help with most of the components. The only one that I'll need your help with is a stone from beyond the stars. One of the meteorites that fell to Earth. They contain the essence of space, and are one of the key components for enchantments involving space. A piece of meteorite. Well, that wouldn't be too hard for me to find. All right. When will you be ready to make the prototype? Ryan closed her eyes in thought at that. Give me 2 hours. That should be enough time to break down Tubrok's spares and get the essence I need. That should also be plenty of time for you to find the rock. After saying that, her eyes suddenly lit up. Oh, while we're at it, do you think we should practice that concealed enchantment technique we bought before? You already got all of the materials for that last time, so it's ready to go whenever. I nodded my head at that. It'd probably be for the best. I plan to use this bag personally, so having people unable to sense the magic on it would be a big help. Hey, can I watch, too? Baihena spoke up, raising her hand from where she sat on her bed. This seems kind of interesting, you know. Naturally, we had no reason to refuse her. All right, you can be in charge of getting us a suitable bag to use. Something inconspicuous. While you do that, I'll get the rock she needs, and she can get whatever essence she was talking about. After saying that, the two girls nodded their heads and began moving. My destination was naturally my computer, where I ran a quick search for meteorite fragments. Even after all this time since they first started falling, it shouldn't be too hard to get one. And sure enough, there were a number of results from all over the world. At random, I plucked one out and brought it to the admin room, having a fist-sized black rock land on my desk after a brief flash of light. To my surprise, this actually didn't disturb Tara at all, and she continued her little nap on my bed as if nothing had happened. Grabbing both the rock and the sword, I made my way towards Tubrok's forge, where I was sure to find Ryan. I was actually pretty interested in the essences she was talking about. What I found when I arrived were two people. One was a somewhat grumpy-looking dwarf working his forge, while the other was the elven goddess I was looking for. She was currently holding up a silver spear, her eyes closed in focus. There was the sound of something cracking, and then a shining blue and white dust began to fall off of the spear, landing at Ryan's feet. This continued for roughly 10 seconds, until a handful of the dust had pooled into a small pile. At that time, the spear seemed to shatter into pieces, Ryan opening her eyes with a somewhat sad look. Pity, I was hoping for a bit more out of this one. It was at that time that she noticed my presence, and grinned mischievously at me. Curious. When I nodded, she began explaining. What she was doing now was a trick that she learned as an enchanter, one that was essential for any high-level enchants. By taking an already magical item, an enchanter could extract the magical essence in a type of powdered mana. This powder, simply called essence of magic, was a common ingredient for enchantments beyond the second tier. Wait, just what level did you manage to get as an enchanter? I couldn't help but ask, looking at her. She had told me about how the second tier of spells began to unlock at level 50 for mages, so she had to at least be that high. Level 100 enchanter, level 20 scholar, level 30 mage. She said proudly, sticking out her chest as she moved to grab the next item from Tubrok's shelves of completed weapons. There were various spears, swords, shields, even some armors. I just hit the level limit before I came to find you, or else I'd keep trying to learn more. I think next time, I'll focus purely on the mage class instead of enchanter. How did she manage to control her classes so well? Is it just because she had a single-minded devotion? I couldn't help but question it mentally, but otherwise watched as she disenchanted the next object. How did you solve the problems of the space and time components? When she heard that, Ryan chuckled slightly. Another elf managed to solve the time component by accident, though all he noticed was that his spell was delayed. As for space, I found it when I was randomly testing out patterns. The real trick was figuring out the triggers for different functions, such as storing or retrieving items by command. Thankfully, I managed to get those when I got my last enchanter level. I had no doubt that Ryan was the highest level enchanter currently on the planet, so it made sense for her to be the first one to discover that. I decided to patiently create a chair to sit and watch as she disenchanted one piece of equipment after another. When Baihena arrived in the forge, I went ahead and created one for her as well, and we simply waited for Ryan to finish. Chapter 90. Bag of Holding. As I watched Ryan disenchanting the various weapons, a thought occurred to me. Ryan, how does this process actually work? Explain it to me. I had an idea for how this could be used, but I needed to confirm my thoughts on the process itself, and there was nobody better to ask. Surprised by my sudden question, Ryan glanced around back at me and smiled, holding a black dagger in her hands. It's actually fairly simple. There is no diagram to go with this, it is a raw application of mana. By using mana that at least doubles the amount originally used in the enchantment, you force the magic within an item to shift around, taking the pieces carrying the enchantment and expelling them. Doing so causes the material of the item to degrade as tiny specks of it are removed, inevitably leading to its collapse. Those tiny specks are the remnants of the enchanted item that contain the mana of the enchantment. But since the item is now broken, the enchantment is as well, making the mana lose its function. I couldn't help but nod my head, before turning to look at Tubrok. If you had enough of this dust, would you be able to melt it down and forge another weapon? This was a technique far beyond what my world was currently capable of, but if it was here in the admin room, such things should be possible. Tubrok was even more surprised by me suddenly addressing him than Ryan had been, but quickly gave the idea some serious thought. Maybe. It could potentially give a result similar to spell metal, but I'd have to check to be sure. Though, the amount of weapons needed would be astronomical if I wanted to make something usable. I gave a silent nod as I heard that, before motioning for Ryan to continue. I wanted them to try this process at least once, to see if there was a noticeable improvement over normal spell metal weapons. If so, it could be another good way to produce godly weapons. If not, all that would be wasted was time. After my little question, I allowed Ryan to finish gathering all of the magic dust that she needed, which ended up using almost all of Tubrok's spare weapons and created a pile of dust that nearly reached up to her knees. Finally, however, she clapped her hands happily while tossing to the side the crumpled remains of the golden shield that she had used as her last sacrifice. Thankfully, every now and then I would move away the pile of discarded items to a storage area, otherwise there would be a mountain of broken armors and weapons. All right, finally done, she said, turning around to grin at us. So, Baihena, did you get a suitable bag? She asked the human goddess, who nodded her head. What she retrieved was a leather satchel which looked vaguely like a coin purse, a small leather bag with a thick string tying the top. This should be inconspicuous enough, right? She asked, tossing the bag towards Ryan, who caught it gently and inspected it. Ryan furrowed her brows slightly, eventually nodded. It should be. The only question is whether or not it will be able to hold the mana for the enchantment. The powder makes that a bit easier, but we'll just have to see for ourselves. After saying that, she tossed the bag onto the floor a short distance away, and then had a look of intense focus on her face. Immediately, I could see lines carving themselves into the ground around the bag, forming into the standard enchantment diagram. However, things didn't end there. Next, several items began appearing one after the other atop the enchantment pattern. First, in each of the 8 outer circles and the 1 inner circle appear a large gem, which I was able to recognize as the gems that I helped her acquire for the enchantment concealment feature that we bought before. After that, green powder began to sprinkle itself along the various lines, followed by a white powder. Finally, a metal container appeared just above the diagram, the bottom of it opening up to let the water spill along the carved lines. It seemed to mix with the green and white powders, creating a light glow that spread through the enchantment diagram. When this glow hit the 9 gathered stones, it began changing colors, going throughout the entire spectrum before the light seemed to fade entirely. Yet, I could tell that the energy was still there, forming a barrier around the enchantment pattern. Now, she began using her actual powers rather than the admin room itself, and the magic powder at her feet flew into motion. Glittering trails of silver, gold, and bronze ascended into the air above the enchantment diagram, spinning in complex patterns before forming over a dozen glowing patterns. Each one seemed to be its own spell diagram, given shape by the magical powder. Rather than hovering in place, they seemed to idly spin and float above the bag, as if their positions didn't matter. And soon, I found out why. When Ryan finished her preparations, the enchantment pattern along the ground lit up with a blue light, following the normal process of enchanting an item. However, when that light touched one of the floating spell diagrams, it magnified its intensity. At the same time, the dust making the spell diagram seemed to collapse, floating down in thin streams towards the bag at the center of the formation. The light seemed to be contained within a small dome, yet it was growing brighter and brighter, soon looking like a small sun. Hold. I could hear Ryan muttering under her breath as I closed my eyes to avoid the bright light. When I opened my eyes again to look at the result of the enchantment, I saw the bag still resting there in the middle of the circle. Scattered around it was what seemed like a pile of ash, and the single sulfur lump that had been placed next to it. And, standing in front of the circle, with a nervous expression on her face, was Ryan, who reached down to pick the bag up. After picking up the bag, she carefully examined it, before running over to the pile of discarded items that I had yet to move away. With an anxious look, she focused on the pile, and a faint light emitted from one of the broken fragments, before it seemed to vanish from view. Narrowing my eyes in focus, I examined the details of the bag that Ryan was now staring at with an excited gaze. Leather bag of holding. Enchantments hidden. Size: 1.75 meters. Weight limit: 500 pounds. Insert removal range: 1 meter. Weight negated: 20%. Time within: 0.5x. Contents: broken shield shard. Well, that was certainly an interesting item window. I suppose the areas struck through are what would not appear in a normal identification. Still, even with it being that limited, it offered a great deal of possibility. Looking back at the diagram, I saw that the 9 stones were still intact, and only the murky water mixture had disappeared. It seemed that this process was still repeatable as long as we gathered the powdered slime, old bones, and deep water again. By the time I finished my little examination, Ryan jumped in front of me, extending the bag to me with both hands, a beaming smile on her face. "It works," she shouted, dropping the leather pouch into my hand. I was a bit surprised by its weight, as the bag itself appeared visibly empty. Yet, it felt like it weighed a couple pounds more than it should. I suppose that is from the partial weight negation. As I thought about that, I focused on the bag, and decided to try using it. Concentrating on emptying it, I heard the thud of something falling at my feet. Looking down, the same shield shard that Ryan had used to test whether or not the bag worked appeared in front of me. Nodding my head in satisfaction, I then looked to Ryan. She was grinning from ear to ear, until she felt something strange tugging at her presence. "Dale," she asked in concern, noticing that I had tried pulling her into the bag. "I need someone to check out the interior." I spoke simply. "I need to know if there is a restriction on placing sharp objects inside, for fear of cutting the bag open from within." I had hoped to play a little prank on her and just send her into the bag without warning, but I guess that the pull was weaker on living creatures. "Ah," she said, nodding her head, allowing the bag to capture her and send her inside of it. Now its weight definitely increased, to the point where I probably wouldn't have been able to hold it with one hand back before I became a keeper. I was sure that she had to be uncomfortably crouched down, seeing as she was taller than size limit, but it was also true that we needed to make sure of the properties within the bag. As such, I gave her about a minute in there before using the bag to pull her back out. As I had expected, when she came out, she was crouched down with her knees almost touching the floor. Standing up, she stretched her arms and legs out with a groan. Well, the inside isn't cloth, at least not in the space the magic created. It's just empty blackness with a smooth barrier. There shouldn't be any problem storing swords or shields, but long weapons like spears probably won't fit. I nodded my head at that. All right, I'll be keeping this one. Your next job is to create 2 more for an experiment to see what happens when you put one bag inside the other. I needed to make sure that there wouldn't be any black holes or spatial tears forming before I actually took this bag down to the mortal world. Rion's eyes seemed to shine as she heard that. All right, that should be fun. After which, she looked over to Tubrok, who seemed to shudder beneath the gaze despite not being looking this way to see it. No doubt, she was thinking of all the items she'd have him make so that she could disenchant them. Shaking my head, I turned to leave the forge with my new bag of holding, before noticing Baihaina staring intently at it. Is there something wrong? I asked her curiously, making her look up at me from the bag. When do you think we'd be able to let the mortals have those? She asked, glancing down at the bag. Again, hearing that, I gave it a bit of thought, though kept walking. She hurriedly got up and followed me in order to hear my answer. Right now they aren't really ready for things of this level, even if it would be convenient. It'd be best to wait for them to discover it themselves, but that will probably take them quite a while. And until then, they already have the quest system which acts as storage. Thinking about it that way, I could potentially fill up the bag of holding with a ton of leather scrolls for various items. Doing it that way might weigh me down, but if I tap into my keeper's strength, then I will easily be able to handle the weight. Hearing my explanation, Baihaina nodded her head. Okay. I think it will really change the world once it is released, though. Especially if Ryon is able to improve it by that time. I couldn't help but smile at that thought. No doubt Ryon was going to do her best to find the upgraded versions of the various spell components able to complete the bag of holding. She likely wouldn't be satisfied until the contents were weightless and did not age. I agree. That's why we need to wait, I said with a chuckle. Until then, this will just be a rather convenient way for me to smuggle items down to the world without people noticing. I should have Tubrok design some armor for me to go with my spell iron sword. Chapter 91. Spirits be with us. After I returned to my room, I found that Tara was absent, likely visiting with either Orivy or Udona. This left the room empty, so I moved over to my computer desk. Propped up against it was my personal sword, which I immediately deposited into the bag of holding, before moving to check on the world. When I checked the time of the world, I saw that roughly 20 more years had passed since I last left it, due to setting the time to accelerate. As such, I decided to check and see how the dwarves had been doing since the discovery of alcohol. I had a feeling that it would be quite an interesting sight to see, so I used the trick Tara taught me to view the events leading up to it more quickly. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore, underscore. After the discovery of the elixir, as the dwarves had taken to calling it, Crown Range underwent a shocking change. No longer was blacksmithing the only highly respected class. Instead, in a rather unusual development, the chef class began to gather more and more attention. That was because they were able to more easily identify and replicate the effects of the elixir. In fact, with Horshaft's claims of how he created the initial product, they already had a steady supply of elixir on hand. The problem was, the effects of the elixir did not target everyone equally. Those with specific classes, the warriors, miners, guards, leatherworkers, and berserkers, found themselves unable to enjoy these effects to the same degree as others. This was a particularly important problem because the ones who could be said to have the greatest need of its ability to relieve pain were just those people. This is where the chefs came in. After studying the initial concoction, they began working with herbalists and alchemists to try to create something stronger. Something that would be able to relieve the pain of even the greatest miners. They tried repeated experiments, but could never quite get anything good enough, not until nearly 2 years later. After 2 years of study, they created a tonic that was able to give the same level of relief to even the guards and the miners that the normal citizens enjoyed. They labeled this creation Firespit, due to the fact that a stray spark caused the liquid to ignite when it was introduced to a blacksmith's workshop. However, the creation of Firespit brought with it another problem. While it allowed those unaffected by the elixir to enjoy its benefits, those with weaker constitutions were hit with something far stronger. When a chef took a glass of firespit for his experiments, he later heard that he was standing naked outside of his cave shouting the glory of his creation. Later studies showed that firespit's ability to relieve pain and worry may have been too impactful, causing weaker dwarves to lose themselves to it. Those under its influence would act in ways that they normally would never dream. Some turned violent, some seemed to enter a depression, but the majority experienced a joy that they had never known after drinking firespit. This pure joy kept bringing those people back to it again and again, eventually consuming the drink faster than the chefs could produce it. However, this only brought out another problem. Now, those guards and miners who had to wait so long to enjoy the simpler benefits of the elixir could only watch in envy at the dwarves who lost themselves to the pleasure of firespit. So, the chefs got to work once again. This time, they even went so far as to trade with the two other dwarven kingdoms, giving them the weaker elixir in exchange for herbs that they suspected would give rise to something even greater. And because of this trade, the three kingdoms of the dwarves were all introduced to the elixir. The search for a drink more powerful than firespit lasted nearly 10 more years, leading to the depression of many miners and guards, before a suitable product was created. By then, even firespit had been introduced to the kingdoms of the hills and plains. This new brew was simply known as blackout, due to the effects of almost immediately knocking out those with weaker constitutions. Blackout spread through Crown Range, and through the entire Iron Dwarf Kingdom in under a fortnight. Finally, the various guards and miners were able to enjoy the benefits brought by firespit, and were able to join them in their regular celebrations. As for the effects that blackout had on a normal dwarf, they were honestly not interested in that. While some were curious about it, it was not to the degree of waiting however long the production of a new brew would take. At least, that was the case for those of the Iron Dwarf Kingdom. For the Hill Dwarves, they had a different issue. Most of their seasoned warriors, who also acted as guards for the major cities and fought against various monsters, were barely affected by this new blackout drink. While they were a much smaller portion of the population, they were no less important as they were responsible for everyone's safety. And so, research began yet again, this time in the kingdom of the Hill Dwarves. They sought the perfect brew, one that would knock out even the hardiest dwarf. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore underscore. Wait, so that's how they become blatant alcoholics. Some never-ending spiral of booze. I asked myself incredulously. Out of curiosity, I went to check the human and beastkin cities. Tara had mentioned to me that they were already producing alcohol long before the dwarves, so I was interested in seeing if they had similar issues. What I found was that the obsession really only occurred with the dwarves. While the humans and beastkin did also mass produce the alcohol, it was not nearly with the same passion. The humans used it as merely a common drink, while the beastkin enjoyed it at festivals. Compared to them, the dwarves who had almost made a religion out of creating alcohol were lightweights. Maybe I should go ahead and fast forward a bit further. I mused to myself. However, there was another matter that I wanted to take care of before I allowed the time to fast forward any further. Pulling out my handy messaging paper, I wrote to Ryan. Think we've got the budget for the next tier or two of monsters. We had only been using 3 tiers for a while now, and I recall seeing there be as many as 10 tiers. Soon, I saw a reply writing itself into the paper. What's our balance at now? That reminded me that I hadn't checked for any new achievements or royalties in a while. I could see the blinking light at the corner of the screen, alerting me to new notifications. Part of me was actually dreading opening it, due to the imminent flood of pop-ups that came with it. Still, I must persevere. Reaching up, I clicked on the icon and found my screen flashing repeatedly with pop-up after pop-up. Some were letting me know about royalties for the items I listed, and others were achievements or technology advancements. I hurriedly closed any of the less interesting windows, the ones that just said stuff like, so and so bought such and such, your royalties are this much. I really didn't need to see every individual window like that. In the end, I was left with a series of achievements, and the technology upgrades. Most of the achievements awarded nothing but points, so I dismissed those readily. There was one, however, that caught my eye. Congratulations. Earth has earned an achievement. For having a civilization reach the Metal Age, your world has earned the Forged from Fire achievement. Plus 15 points. Guess the dwarves finally managed to qualify for an advancement. That, or this message has been waiting for me for quite a while. I thought to myself, before noticing another similar message. Congratulations. Earth has earned an achievement. For having a civilization reach the Arcanum Age, Your world has earned the Spellforge achievement. +15 points. I'm going to guess elves for this one. I thought to myself with a nod, before opening up the technology advancement window. This time, the list was far too large for me to pay attention to everything, as it seemed that the different civilizations hit a sudden boom for technology growth. A few notable advancements were two races that seemed to get the second level of boats, as well as several accounts of history documentation 1 foot. Putting all of that aside, I let the points tally up with what I already had in my balance, before writing the number back to Ryan. 2,283. How was a keeper supposed to actually run out of points, unless they kept buying more and more worlds? Well, that was probably exactly what happened. After all, more worlds meant more fighting power, and more chances to survive the keeper games. Of course, to a newer keeper like myself, the points just seemed to add up quicker than I could spend them. We should be good for 2 more tiers, then. Ryan replied after a little while. So, taking that into consideration, I spent a total of 600 points to buy the next 2 monster tiers, while at the same time finally understanding what monsters really were. Originally, I had suspected that monsters were just the more hostile creatures, while animals were considered the rest. However, through the monster tiers I was able to learn the true difference. Animals were creatures that had no ability to wield any type of energy, such as ki or mana. Monsters, on the other hand, had at least some potential to do so. This gave them an obvious advantage over animals of the same level as them. Likewise, as later tiers increased the complexity of monsters, it also increased their abilities. Although the 3rd tier was the first in which they were born able to use magic, there were various monsters from both the 1st and 2nd tiers which could be trained to either use ki or mana. This is probably why the price didn't change between the 2nd and 3rd tiers. However, from the 3rd to 4th, and 4th to 5th, the prices doubled. In the 4th tier, it lists monsters able to use more developed abilities, such as casting actual spells. For the 5th tier, monsters become able to use multiple types of energies, and some may even appear that use mixed energies. This caused me to look forward to seeing what types of creatures might appear in my world from now on. After buying the 2 tiers for monsters, I decided to do another great leap forward. This time, 200 years should give plenty of time for various advancements. Of course, I put all of the normal alarms in place to warn me of an impending disaster, so I didn't have to worry about that. With this fast forward, everyone's incarnations should be over with, aside from Ryan's. At the same time, given their rate of advancement, I should be able to spend some more time down in the mortal world. I closed my eyes and looked forward to that, before turning back and looking at my bed. How long has it been since I actually slept? I wondered silently, thinking back. Recalling it, I hadn't had a proper sleep since before the Centaur and Halfling War. That's already several days where I hadn't slept once. And that sudden realization seemed to make all that time awake crash into me at once. Okay. I can sleep for a little while the world fast forwards. Then, maybe I'll descend for a bit, see how the world is working up close. Chapter 92. The Race of Heroes. After sleeping for an unknown amount of time, roughly 5 hours according to the clock on the computer, I managed to get myself up and moved over to the screen again. I wanted to go ahead and prepare to descend again so that I could take a closer look at the world, but first I wanted to make sure that there weren't any major developments over the 200 years that had passed. So, my first action was to open the notifications again. Some of your species have undergone an evolution, and will have their base stats permanently changed for all successive generations. Centaurs. Agility +1. Dwarves. Strength +1. Lycan. Awareness +1. Ursa. Strength +1. Okay. Guess they were due for an evolution sooner or later. The Felon and Kitsune will probably follow soon after. Elves will probably still take a while yet, because of their long lives. I mused as I looked at the information, though it was the next window that surprised me the most. Congratulations. Earth has earned an achievement. For having a race evolve into sentience outside of the system's guidance, your world has earned the Evolver achievement. +10 points, evolving trait unlocked. When I read that, I couldn't help but stop and blink for several seconds before grabbing the piece of paper we used to communicate. Evolving trait. Explain. I quickly wrote to Terra, not wanting to have a trait attached to the world that I did not know about at least somewhat. You got one already. That's pretty fast, came the reply soon after. It makes it easier for natural evolution to take place, and generally uses the first creature to evolve as a base template for success. Later sapient creatures will typically have at least something in common with the first race to evolve like that, even if it is just certain organs or bone structures. Things like one brain and one heart, or walking upright. That was a surprisingly detailed explanation, compared to what she normally gave. And as I looked through the notifications, I saw that there was still one window remaining. Opening it up, I hoped for a bit more good news. An unidentified race has ascended to sapience. At any point, you may purchase them into the system of your world. Until such time, they will be treated as typical monsters, and will be unable to access various systems of the world restricted to registered life forms. Unable to access the systems, so they won't be able to level up, or issue quests, or things like that. They probably won't even be able to see the interface. The ramifications of this were quite great. After all, without being able to level up, it would be almost impossible for any sapient race to survive for long against the ever-growing monsters of the world. Even the fact that they evolved to sapience was likely due to luck, with them not living near the more powerful monsters. Nonetheless, I went to look through the world, doing a search for this new species. What I found was a race surviving on one of the uninhabited continents of the world. From the looks of things, they had just barely began using stone tools and building shelters. The race itself was tall, over 3 meters for a grown adult, with thick green skin and bulging muscles. On their heads were 3 vertical eyes. They seemed to lack any hair, and they only had 3 fingers and a thumb on their large hands. When I looked at their stats, I began to understand why they were able to survive as long as they had. Race name: Unclassified. Comprehension: 4. Agility: 12. Strength: 23. Lifespan: 95. Luck: 8. Awareness: 17. Male. Female ratio: 3. Example adult male. Example adult female. To put it simply, their base statistics were through the roof. They could likely pick up and carry a centaur with one arm, and not even break a sweat. At first, I thought that they looked like orcs or ogres, but their eyes ruined that image for me. The only thing that they were really lacking was their comprehension, which was still almost on the same level as the elves and centaurs. Curious, I checked to see how much it would cost to bring this new race into the system, to let them have classes and quests and all that. To my surprise, such an unbalanced race would actually cost 175 points. Even more than the dungeon cores, with all of their added abilities. Grabbing the paper once again, I wrote a quick message to everyone. Meeting now. Living room. After saying that and letting the message send, I quickly got up and moved to the other room to wait for the others. This was a rather big decision, and it deserved to be spoken of with all of the gods and goddesses. When I arrived to the living room, I found Udona, Irena, and Calliope all standing there already, talking with one another and looking confused. What's going on, Dale? Irena asked as she noticed my arrival, drawing the attention of the Kitsune and Ursa goddesses. Ah, sorry, but could you wait until everyone gets here? I asked patiently. Soon, Baihaina arrived, and I had to say the same thing once again. After that, the others all seemed to arrive at the same time, though from different directions. Only Tara seemed to understand what was going on, and had a pleased smile on her face as she arrived with Orivy and Akalia. Just like during the previous god meeting, I created a large table, with plenty of chairs for everyone and a large cushion for Trival. Sorry for calling everyone here on short notice. However, there was a recent development in the world that requires our attention. When I said that, everyone's curious expressions vanished, and they instantly became more serious. A new race has evolved in the world, and grown to the level where the system recognizes them. There were a few surprised gasps and murmurs after that revelation, but I kept speaking. Normally, I wouldn't mind simply buying them into the system, but given the race in question, I wanted to consult everyone, as well as the potential steps we might take to welcome them, if we do so. After saying that, I created a screen behind me for everyone to see, displaying the racial statistics for this new race. Then, Tara cleared her throat slightly, motioning for me to take a look, and I realized that the information was written backwards, so I quickly flipped it around. As you can see, their abilities far surpass the base levels of any other race, with the exception of their intelligence. Orivy furrowed her brows, crossing her small arms in front of her chest. So, what's the problem? Can't we just buy them like normal, just a bit more expensive? However, Baihaina quickly shook her head to dismiss that. Their strength itself can be an issue later. Especially if they are able to adjust to magic, their awareness would probably lend to the ability to control the energies well. They would be a powerful force that could overwhelm any of our races with the same numbers and levels. I imagine that, after inviting them to the system, the hero class will be common with them, given their monstrous stats. I nodded my head towards Bihana. That was one of my concerns as well. Another was whether or not we should get a new god or goddess for this race, should we buy them? If they don't have one, then there will likely be discrimination against them in the future. However, if they do, then that will only be more power for them. With their strength, even though they are behind in terms of technology, they could pose a very real threat to the other races when they meet. To my surprise, the next to speak wasn't either Orivy or Bihana, who had taken up the two sides of the argument. Instead, it was Irena. I think we should buy them. Otherwise, they are doomed to extinction. She said simply, her face remaining impassive. While they can survive now with their abilities, more powerful monsters will begin to appear around them, and it won't take long before they are wiped out without the system to support them. Udona nodded her head at that, agreeing. I think any race deserves a chance at life. I do not support giving them a god, though, she shuddered slightly as she said that, likely remembering her own birth. I didn't know if her suggestion was for the sake of the world, or for the unborn deity. Bihana smiled slightly as she heard that. Without the guidance of a deity, they will not be as united as our races. This will reduce their overall strength, and bring it more towards the level where our races could potentially interact with them in the future without it becoming too dangerous for either side. Tubrok was the next to speak, crossing his hands on the table as he leaned forward. How about we take a vote? Dat way, it's fair and, there won't be no complaints later. As the others heard him, they couldn't help but nod their heads. With the information already out there wasn't much more left to talk about but the final verdict. And after the votes, the decision was made. With only Orivy, Kelliope, and Tribal opposing, the vote was 8-3, in favor of purchasing the new race. However, when the vote turned to getting a new god or goddess, it was unanimous. Nobody wanted a new god in the admin room, at least not yet. I nodded my head after counting all the votes. All right, then it's settled. Now, since we are buying them, what should we call them? Tara almost instantly raised her hand to speak up when I asked that. Since they are the race of heroes resembling orcs, why not call them Herrick? I swear, I heard at least 3 groans from around the table when she suggested that name. I never thought I would meet someone with a naming sense worse than me, and that it would be Tara. As I thought that, I looked around, almost hopeful for someone else to have a better suggestion. However, whether it was Tribal, Orivy, Udona, or any of the others, nobody chimed in. So, I could only sigh helplessly. All right, then, we'll buy the Herrick race. As I said that, I entered their name into the racial window, and opted to purchase them immediately. And with this, I declare the second godly meeting official concluded. You may all go back to whatever it is you were doing. After I dismissed them, there were various sighs throughout the room as the gods dispersed, most going back to their own rooms while 2 or 3 stuck around to chat. Tara actually walked up to me with Orivy holding her hand and smiled. Well, that was productive. What are you planning to do now? Looking at their hopeful expressions, I could guess that they wanted to spend a bit of time with me. Sadly, I shook my head. I already had plans. I planned to descend for a bit. See how the Elven Society is doing before maybe moving on to one of the other races. I explained. Out of all of the races, the one whose society I know the least about was actually the elves. So, I felt it necessary to get a closer look at how they worked. And indeed, Orivy frowned slightly when she heard that. Ah, well, when you are done with all of that, how about playing for a little bit? Big Sis and I made a pair of sisters in the mortal world for our new incarnations. Once you're done with checking up on everything, why not going down to visit us? She asked with an honest smile, and I could only nod my head in agreement before turning around and heading for my room. Okay, now can I finally descend? I asked myself as I immediately began preparing the body that I planned to descend in. Chapter 93. Cowabunga, dude. I let out a deep breath after I descended. The body that I chose was that of a fairly normal elf with pitch black hair going down just below my shoulders. Taking in a deep breath, I felt a small smile tug at my lips as I smelled the salty air. The area that I chose to descend at wasn't the capital but a site which had become even more busy over the years. As I had descended a short distance away from the nearest town, I began walking at a brisk pace as I checked my surroundings. Behind me laid a wide meadow which continued as far as the eye could see, while in front of me I could see a dirt path leading towards a beach. Among the beach were several large rocks that had been uprooted and reshaped, turning into a statue of Ryan. I could even see the distant town, just at the edge of the grassy landscape and overlooking the beach. It seemed far more developed than I had expected, with several tall buildings made of white stone, and almost seemed to glitter with the ocean behind it. Just beyond the statue, there was an archway made of stone standing above the dirt path. Even though the writing seemingly scribbled on it was far from English, I could still clearly read it. Cowbunga. According to the translation that the system provided, it loosely meant, shielded by the goddess. This was the very city that Ryan had stepped forward to protect all those years ago from a tidal wave, and her efforts did not go unrewarded. Aside from the statue, they had even renamed the city itself after that event, it seemed. The one thing that confused me was the complete lack of foot traffic. It was already well into the day, so I had expected there to be quite a lot of people moving about. In fact, when I had casually looked at this place on the map in the past, it had indeed been even more busy than even the capital city of the Elven Kingdom. Curious about what was going on, I increased my pace slightly, taking a moment to assess my character sheet, as it had been quite a while since I had descended to look at it. Name: Dale Mitchell. Race: Elf Keeper. Health: 157 157, 128,260 128,260. Mana: 77 77, 40,596 40,596. Strength: 6 248. Key: 176 176, 55,140 55,140. Stamina: 7 225. Intelligence: 6 182. Dexterity: 14 255. Wisdom: 15 298. Luck: 6 69. Charm: 7 69. Class list: Alchemist 1 38. Archer 0 93. Architect 0 78. Archmage 0 23. Armorer 0 49. Artisan 0 34. Assassin 0 52. Bard 0 73. Berserker 0 55. Blacksmith 0 82. Carpenter 1 79. Chef 0 60. Cleric 0 30. Druid 0 81. Enchanter 5 100. Engineer 0 5. Farmer 0 43. Gambler 0 6. Guard 0 63. Herbalist 2 50. Hero 1 3. Hunter 0 91. Jeweler 0 12. Knight 0 58. Leader 1 35. Leatherworker 0 64. Mage 2 87. Martial Artist 0 96. Merchant 0 34. Miner 0 68. Monk 7 99. Monster Tamer 2 64. Ninja 5 73. Noble 0 20. Painter 0 30. Pirate 0 13. Priest 1 54. Rogue 0 59. Scholar 1 34. Scout 0 51. Sculptor 0 32. Shaman 0 43. Spirit Hunter 15 42. Spirit Tamer 6 60. Swordsman 0 35. Tailor 0 26. Warrior 2 70. Weaponmaster 0 3. Note to self: children, level 50 stats are a far cry from level 2500, I thought to myself when I nearly tripped over my own feet after seeing my keeper stats. Of course, if Terra's words are true, then I won't grow too much past this for a while. Though there may still be some powerful existences in the future that are at the peak of their classes, so I may get a buff there. Still, that made me definitely decide to keep as low of a profile as I could, and not reveal my keeper abilities. Glancing around, I decided to perform a quick test, moving over behind the statue so that those in the city wouldn't be able to see me, even if they were outside. Reaching into my bag of holding, I pulled out the sword that Tubrok had given me. Using only my normal strength, I placed my finger on the edge of the sword, hissing lightly in pain as a small trail of blood flowed from an open wound. Okay, so that really is sharp. I hadn't even pressed down when it had already cut into me, and I had no doubt it could have chopped off my finger like it was nothing if I had done so. I even lost a single point of health from that. Next, I focused, drawing on my keeper abilities, though I kept my mana and key sealed to avoid detection. This time, I obviously used a different finger and pressed it on the blade of the sword again. To my surprise, I felt the cold edge of the blade pressing against my finger, but there was no feeling of pain. Pressing harder, and I felt only mild discomfort. Curious to see just how far this went, I actually gripped the blade in my hand and squeezed, finally managing to draw a bit of blood. However, even then it barely hurt, and as soon as I let go of the blade, the wound healed quickly. Okay. So my skin really became tougher with the boost in stats. Quite a bit so. I mused to myself as I stored the blade away once again, returning myself to a normal level of power. If it was like this, I could be considered to be wearing heavy armor at all times when in keeper mode. When I stepped away to begin moving towards the city again, I winced slightly as I noticed two deep footprints where I had previously been standing. Okay. So I get heavier too. That is good to know. Shaking my head, I finally made my way towards the city, quickly dismissing the notification that I had gained a scout level as I did so. This was my first scout level, so it similarly came with an ability. Though, this ability was just a mental compass, which apparently let me identify north. There were two guards standing at the wall surrounding the city near the gate. Though, instead of on the ground in front of the gate, they stood atop the 6-meter-high wall, with one watching outside the city and the other watching inside. Who goes there? The guard watching outside called to me in an almost panicked tone, and I could definitely tell something was wrong by now. I am Jael, a traveler. What is going on here? I called up to the guard, the other one still not turning around even though he knew there was an outside at the gate. You haven't heard. Get inside somewhere, quick. The Ninja Turtles are coming. The guard let out a panicked warning, causing me to stop dead in my tracks. Ninja Turtles. Now that I could see inside the gate of the city, I saw that all of the doors for the buildings were closed. Some even had gone so far as to mold the marble stone of the building to cover part of the door to truly lock it. Where am I to get inside? I called up. All the buildings have shut themselves. While a Ninja Turtle sounded rather amusing, I didn't want to underestimate anything that would throw a town like this into a panic. The guard stared for a few moments, before realizing that the city had already gone into lockdown. The wall. Here. He slammed his hand down onto the surface of the wall in front of him, and multiple protrusions emerged to serve as handholds to climb up. If you don't want to die, climb. Well, faced with that choice, there really was not any reason for me to refuse. Hastily, I grabbed onto the first protrusion, and quickly climbed my way up. Even though I was still fairly low-leveled, I was able to climb to the top of the wall within a minute. And after getting to the top, I finally saw what the guards were so worried about. They're here. The one watching towards the ocean muttered as I stood up. I could barely make them out from this distance, but I could see a large number of shapes moving out of the water. Each one seemed to be moving at roughly a walking pace, so they did not seem too frightening. At least, not until I looked closely to inspect the information on them. Level 59 Ninja Turtle. Okay, so they really are Ninja Turtles. That, or the system called them that because it is what the locals identify them as. I was wondering why this was, until I saw the one I was focusing on abruptly vanish, moving over a dozen meters forward with a single step. Oh, fuck, they have chakra. That means that they can use ki and mana, too. I was suddenly very glad that the guard had been kind enough to bring me up here. I don't suppose that they can climb the wall, can they? I asked, looking over to him. He was wearing leather armor, with a bow and quiver on his back. His hair was golden, and his features sharp. No, thankfully, else, we wouldn't be able to keep watch during their tide. He answered, letting out a sigh of relief. This happens often. That was a disturbing thought. I might be able to survive if I went down there, but only if I activated my keeper abilities. Even then, there were at least a few hundred of them. Once every year, the guard says, turning back around to once again look towards the meadows. The Ninja Turtles surface from the seas and move into the town to look for food, staying for 3 days and nights, before finally leaving into the seas once more. The first time, we lost nearly half our men and women to them, so we don't allow anyone outside during their visit. He says the final word with an ugly expression. Have you guys considered moving the town? I had to ask, though I did feel somewhat guilty. I knew that these turtles had to be a result of buying the 5th tier of monsters, due to their abilities. The guard turned to look at me as if I had considered blasphemy. And, in truth, maybe I had. You really don't know where this is, do you? He asked, doing his best to keep his expression calm. This is the city of Cowabunga, the land where the goddess herself appeared to protect her people. We cannot forsake that favor. By moving the town after the danger has passed. They made it to the feeding ground. The other guard interrupted, reporting the progress of the turtles. When I turned back, I found that they had completely vanished from the beach already, and were instead well inside the city. They had begun surrounding a circular building with an open roof, inside of which was a pile of animal corpses. I could see some that looked like boars, or giant lizards, all haphazardly piled up. There seemed to be a few ditches dug into the ground beneath the wall, allowing the turtles to gradually move into the feeding ground to get at the dead animals. This is why we don't leave. The guard that had been talking to me said. We are able to deal with them. We just have to give them what they want. Okay, so the Ninja Turtles are carnivores. I can understand why they can be seen as a natural disaster now. So, do the two of you just stay up here for 3 days and wait for them to leave? I couldn't help but ask. While this was certainly one way to see the elven culture, it is not quite what I had in mind. Someone will send us rations once a day, by means of a flying animal. He said, pointing to a nearby building with a large open window near the top. Though, I suppose they'll need to send another portion now. If they see anything moving along the ground, they swarm at it. So, you can't exactly leave until they are gone, unless you want to try to outrun them. And it was unlikely that outrunning them would even be a possibility for a normal elf, given their ninja abilities. No, I'm fine staying up here for a while. Mind if we talk a bit, though? It doesn't seem like any of us are going anywhere. Why can't I just descend and find a normal city? Chapter 94. The Turn of the Tide. For the next 3 days, the three of us atop the wall truly did not dare to leave it for any reason. That was because we saw firsthand what would happen to anyone the turtles caught. With the gates wide open, and nobody there to stop it, a wandering tiger walked into the city, following the stench of blood in the air. However, the moment the turtles saw it, over 50 of them disappeared. In the next instant, the tiger had already been ripped to shreds, blood and gore splattering everywhere. It had not even had a chance to react as the turtles appeared around and overtop it. When I asked why the gate had to remain opened, Thal, the guard that had welcomed me when I first arrived, explained that it was necessary. Sometimes, they would leave the gate closed to prevent the turtles from spreading out of the city. However, when that happened, the turtles actually destroyed a section of the wall and several buildings in order to find food when they ran out of their offerings. So, for those 3 days, I simply continued talking to them about what could be seen as common matters, using the excuse that I had been wandering the wilderness for 100 years. There were several things that simply didn't make sense to me. For one, I saw the makings of a small landing for boats along the beach, yet not a single boat or its remains could be found. When I asked Thal about this, he looked out to the waters, and said that it wasn't safe to venture out. Unsure what he meant, I also looked into the water, using key to amplify my sight. It was only then when I saw something lurking beneath the surface, less than 200 meters from the shore. A massive creature, at least 30 meters long, looking like a giant fish. I couldn't make out many details from this distance, but it was enough for me to appraise the creature. Level 269 Shallows King. I subconsciously gulped when I read that information. In the current period, that was almost the strongest creature that could exist in the entire world. Thal, seeming to understand that I saw something, nodded his head. He told me that he thinks that was why the turtles come to land in search of food, because the waters are too dangerous. Part of me considered finding a way to secretly kill the monster, but doing so wouldn't really solve anything. The locals would still be afraid to set out in the waters, and there was every chance that the giant fish didn't really have anything to do with the turtles coming ashore. It might simply be a migratory habit. 1-800-GOD-DES hotline, is Ryan available? I closed my eyes and prayed when our period of solitude atop the wall was nearing the end of the 3rd day. Dale, hey, what's up? I didn't expect a prayer from you. Came the hurried response. You still stuck on the wall. Oh, so she knew about that. Yeah, I had something to ask you. Is your incarnation anywhere near Cowbunga? Look straight ahead. 3rd house on the left. No, sorry, other left. 2nd floor window. Surprised, I let her voice guide my eyes, and saw a young woman waving at me through an opening in the wall that vaguely resembled a window. Her hair was silver, flowing down past where I could see, and she was dressed in white and gold robes. So, what did you need me for? Well, that certainly made things more embarrassing. Thankfully, they did have some rudimentary plumbing for us atop the wall, in the form of a hole going straight down. Not my proudest moment. Is there anything you can do to help this town? As the goddess of magic, surely she had to have some ideas. Well, I mean, there's nothing I can do. She answered vaguely, and I could see a troubled look on her incarnation. My mage level is really too low for it to make sense that this incarnation could come up with it. I've been staying here for a few years to study those turtles, and try to figure out how I could make a magic item that stopped them, but nothing has come to mind. We would need a strong ward, but that is in Archmage territory. Could you whisper the idea to one of the stronger mages? Maybe get them to come here and help. Maybe. I've been trying with this one local guy, but he's been stubborn. That's another reason my incarnation is here in person. My levels were already made public, so I hope to convince him one way or the other. But, maybe. I saw her incarnation looking up at me with a gleam in her eye. I'm not going to like this, am I? I asked, shaking my head and sighing. Thal looked at me in confusion, while the other guard maintained his endless duty of watching the activity of the turtles. Oh, come on, Tilda. It'll only take a week or two. She pleaded, leaning against the window. You can stay here with me in the meantime. Nobody knows your levels, so we can just tell them that you are strong enough to set up the wards. While honestly, the idea of staying down here for weeks was not appealing to me, I did have to admit that it would save countless lives if it worked. Not to mention, it would give me more chance to learn about the fundamental nature of magic. Alright, I'll do it. What do you have in mind? It's simple, really. If anyone asks, just tell them that you have high levels as a mage and archmage. I'll guide you through the specifics. She promised, smiling happily and nodding from the window, before moving away from it. I had the feeling that I didn't know what I just got myself into. But either way, our stay upon the wall only lasted for a few more hours. A jet black bird, similar to a large crow or raven, was sent out one last time carrying fruits for the three of us to eat. This has been our regular diet for the last 3 days. Anyways, soon we could see the turtles all beginning to wander back to the shore, leaving trails of blood and gore all throughout the city. Seeing that, the 2 guards let out sighs of relief, thankful that no elves had died this year. With Thal and Idris's powers, they were able to create a set of stairs leading down the wall, which looked like they had always been there. Most likely, the stairs were only taken away during times like this. So, what brings you to Cowabunga jail? Thal finally asked once the situation calmed down. I could see doors opening in the various buildings, and elves walking out. Some began grabbing tools to clean up the mess on the streets as if it were only natural, while other smaller elves ran about and played. He's with me, Tilda. A female voice called out, and I could see Rion's incarnation running towards us quickly, waving her arms to get our attention. I asked him to come here, we're friends from the capital, before he started traveling. She explained after she arrived in front of us, leaning over and panting for breath. I could understand her exhaustion, as the classes she told me she had would do nothing for her stamina. Rinnan, Thal said with a bemused smile. Could you not have called him here when the turtle tide was due? The poor man almost lost his life if he had come just a few moments later. Sorry. She smiled to him, before reaching out and taking my hand. Now that I was able to see her, I could appreciate that she had a pretty good figure, even for an elf. Aside from her hair and face, she looked almost identical to the Rion up in the admin room. I hoped he would show up a few days ago, so that he could see it firsthand. Anyways, with his help this should be the last time we have to deal with the tide. Thal was taken aback by Rinnan's confident declaration, before turning to look at me, and back to her. And just how is he going to do that? He asked suspiciously. Before I could answer for myself, Rinnan jumped in. He's a ward specialist, and told me that he had found a way to stop monsters from entering the city. That's why I invited him over here so urgently. Thal thought about that, but simply let out a sigh, seeming to accept the situation. Alright, fine. Hopefully this time, your plan actually works. He didn't seem to have much faith in Rinnan's plans, which seemed ironic considering her true nature. It will. You'll see, next year they won't even be able to enter the town. She repeated before dragging me back towards the house. Come on, Jail, we've got a lot to prepare. I saw Thal smiling knowingly at me as I left, as if watching an unfortunate victim being lured away. Once we got back to her place, she closed the door, which automatically sealed itself behind us. Finally, she muttered to herself. Okay, what do you need to know for this to work? She asked, looking up at me. Rion's connection with her incarnation seemed much stronger than that of Terra, likely due to those restraints that the latter had to deal with. First, what are wards? Second, how do I even do what you are wanting me to? I asked, finding a chair in the next room and sitting down. I was rather surprised to find that there was only one chair in the room, but Rinnan didn't seem to mind. She simply walked forward and sat on my lap sideways, as if it was natural. Wards are basically large-scale enchantments. However, the class governing them is the Archmage instead of the Enchanter, and the setup process is quite different than enchanting items. With enough power and materials, I could ward the entire city to turn invisible if I wanted. Monster barriers are considerably more simple than that, thankfully. She answered casually, smiling at me as she talked. Okay, that's the what. Now, the how. Fine, fine. It'll take a few days for me to drill the basics of wards into you, and then I'll teach you the specific ward that will keep monsters away. Once you've set up the ward here, and we prove it works next year, I can share the information with the other cities, saying that I learned it from you. I nodded to her explanation, though found a few things weird. I thought that the elves already discovered wards. If I remembered right, they had advanced to the second or third tier of the magic, so they should be able to do something like this on their own. At that, Rinnan let out a long sigh. Well, it's not that easy, Dale. Sorry, Jail. The wards that they've learned until now were largely accidental, either the one or two granted by the Archmage class, or them experimenting and finding something by luck. Very few have devoted themselves to actually studying wards, because they go against commonly understood principles of magic. Without waiting for me to ask for an explanation, she simply continued talking. It is commonly believed that only a creature capable of thought can produce mana. Monsters are already a controversial subject for many elves, because they don't want to admit that there might be other ways to do it, or that monsters are as intelligent as people. They can understand enchantments, because the mana used comes from either the enchanter, or the one wielding the enchanted item. A ward, however, is different. They don't seem to need refueling, and can last without an apparent power source. And that's just not possible, even for magic. I interrupted. Right. It's really not. They just don't understand the logic behind it. In reality, all wards have a common basic principle which people have failed to properly grasp yet. And that is to serve as a mana collector. With the materials and designs for wards, all of the known ones include a particular diagram that saps very small amounts of mana from all nearby creatures constantly. Such an insignificant amount that it is not even noticed. But multiply that by every elf, every monster. It adds up fast. I suspect there are other ways to power wards, but that is the only currently known method. She finally took a deep breath, ending her explanation. Would that really be enough to fend off the turtles for 3 days, then? Even if the ward built up strength for a full year, those turtles weren't exactly weak. Well, not exactly. What we are going to do isn't a barrier to prevent access, but a field to prevent approach. If it works, the turtles should simply move on to a different feeding ground once they appear here, as if the land had become barren. A barrier would be easier, but also less likely to work. Great, I muttered. So the future of the city relies on my ability to create an advanced ward with no real practical knowledge, under the watchful eye of hundreds of elves. No pressure. I know, right, she said with a giggle. I'm hoping that this will create a trend for researching into wards once it works. There are so many possibilities that haven't been explored. Maybe next time, I'll incarnate as an archmage. Chapter 95. The First True Ward. After making Rinnan get off my lap, the two of us went right to work. And by work, I mean she began lecturing. Alright, so, the basics of wards are actually pretty simple. She promised, though simple for her could mean a variety of different things by now. For instance, the very easiest ward is a simple shield. Saying so, she grabbed a nearby scroll and unfurled it, showing a diagram that looked considerably different than what I recognized for spells. For one, it was not a single circle on the outer layer, but there were what appeared to be separate partially completed diagrams tacked onto the side of it. Yet, the very interior of the diagram was still recognizable as the basic shield spell that I had learned long ago. All wards consist of at least 4 components: the link, the spell, the trigger, and the source. The first 3 are easy to understand, but the source is what really gets people confused all the time, because they can't understand the principle behind it. According to current scholars, it shouldn't work. As said that, she pointed to one of the semicircle diagrams along the outer edge of the pattern. As I explained before, the main point behind this is that it siphons mana from any nearby source. When I tried to explain that to people, they denied it because they could not measure the mana being taken. That's because the siphon regulates the intake to not be more than the individual's natural recovery, so it doesn't damage the people it is made to protect. When I heard that, I couldn't help but interrupt. But wait, what natural recovery? I've never noticed any passive region for mana. Sure, Just sit around and wait for a while and it'll come back slowly. But I've never seen anything like that for mana. Rinnan blinked, but then let out a long sigh. Let me start from the beginning, then. Some of this is theoretical information, but most of it has been proven. Now, mana is the energy to exert your will onto the world around you, in the form of various spells and abilities, correct? I nodded my head at that. Then, where does it come from? The head, right? Or, the brain specifically? She smiled slightly at my answer. That's right. Mana is simply a thought-given energy. When you expend too much of it, your head begins to hurt, like a common headache. Eventually, when you completely run out of mana, your head will hurt so bad that you can't form a coherent thought. However, like all headaches, it will gradually go away over time. This is the same rate that you recover your mana. Likewise, some healing spells will alleviate the symptoms, and give someone suffering mana exhaustion headaches a brief period where they can use mana again. Now, when your mana is at full capacity, that recovery process is practically non-existent, because there is nothing to recover. This is where the ward comes in. It saps the mana away in such small amounts that your natural healing abilities make up for it in an instant. If there were just 1 or 2 people, that wouldn't be enough to power a ward. But, with over 1,000 elves in the city, plus whatever monsters they bring in, that is more than enough. Imagine that for every 100 elves, the ward acquires 1 mana per second. At 1,000 elves, that becomes 10 per second. Over 100,000 mana every day. And that is only for as long as it takes for the ward to fully charge its energy. Once the mana limit is reached, even that little drain won't be there anymore, until the ward is used. I considered her words for a little while, before raising another question. Doesn't that make wards too overpowered? I mean, even if it only raises 100,000 mana a day, how much could the usage of its effect actually cost? At this, Rinnan's smile turned a bit bitter. Well, that's where things get complicated. The cost of the spell is directly related to how large it is. For example, say a normal shield spell costs 10 mana per minute to completely surround you, but the cost increases when you are hit. To cover an entire city the size of Cowabunga, it would cost at least 10,000 times that, just to hold the shield in place. The actual act of defending attacks would also be a major drain. Depending on the storage limit of the ward, it could be entirely drained in under an hour, and need weeks to recharge to its full potential. Okay, I had to admit that made it less overwhelming. But, to store that much mana, it can't be as simple as drawing the diagram, right? After all, even an iron sword could only hold a few hundred mana before shattering. You're right, and that's where things get tricky. At the center of every ward, you need to place a control device that connects to the trigger. This device also has to have an object placed in it that stores the mana for the entire ward. The only thing I've found so far that can store that kind of energy without breaking is a pure crystal. It was at that point that her shoulders began to slump down. I managed to get one as a reward from the queen for gifting them various items, but that's just enough for one ward. I won't be able to do anything for all the other towns. I couldn't help but reach a hand out, patting her shoulder gently as I smiled to her. Let's start here. If the ward works, maybe the queen will consider reinforcing the other cities that are in danger as well. Her head nodded faintly when she heard that, before her hands came up and lightly slapped her cheeks. Okay, you're right. Anyways, we need to make sure that this works first. So, there are 2 more things that I need to explain to you about wards. The area they cover, and the trigger mechanism. Saying that, she took a deep breath before continuing. For the area, it's really easy. It is defined by where you place the wards. To create a warded area, you need a minimum of 3 separate ward markers. The more markers you have, the larger the area and more detailed you can make it. To create a perimeter around the entire city, I imagine we'll need at least 50. Each ward marker is simply an item upon which the pattern for the ward is drawn. It can be facing in any direction, but must be within a certain range of its neighbor markers. We can use the city's walls for this. Finally, the triggering mechanism. After the area of the ward is laid out, you have to define its control point with one final marker placed inside the area. This marker will be different. To demonstrate, she ran up to her room, grabbed another scroll, and came down. It seemed to depict a different diagram on it than before, though there were many similarities. In the triggering mechanism, the trigger diagram takes the primary position, while the main function is outlined on the side. She pointed out the 2 big changes, before rolling the scroll up. We just need to have the crystal embedded within the mechanism, and we can activate it at will. Now that she had apparently finished explaining everything, she let out a long sigh of relief, before lifting her head back up. Now, any questions? Yes, just one. You said that it would take a few days to finish explaining everything to me, that was less than an hour. I glanced outside, seeing that the sun hadn't even set yet. Oh, I was hoping to spend the rest of the time humping like Linox in heat. She admitted quite readily, causing my mouth to gape open just slightly. What? You can't say it wouldn't be fun. Besides, I really want to know if there would be anything special about a child born from the descended bodies of a keeper and a goddess. You have to admit, you are at least a little curious, right? I don't know which to retort about. That you want to keep me here for sex, or that you want a baby purely for research purposes. Ryan, you are the goddess of magic and wealth, not wisdom. Stop taking Akalia's job. Technically, you just retorted about both of them. Besides, we still need to have you practice the diagram a few times to make sure you can get it right while everyone is watching. Knowing you, that should only take a couple days, but then we have to actually carve it into the stone walls 30 times. Unless you feel like training the druid class for a while first so you can do it more easily. The city stopped devoting resources to me when I tried to assert my theories. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore, underscore. Thal Highborn couldn't help but smile wryly as he watched the traveler jail being dragged away by the mad enchanter Rinnan. His partner Karihan walked up to him, dark circles under his eyes from the 3-day duty. He's a friend of hers, huh? He asked skeptically, glancing in the direction that the two had left in. Seems that way. Thal nodded. I just hope she doesn't do anything too crazy this time. He didn't want another repeat of the City of Lights incident, where one of her wards managed to accidentally make the entire city, and everyone inside of it glow brightly for over an hour. Leave them to what they want to do. We've got some time off now. Karihan said with a faint smile, followed by a yawn. I could sleep for a week. Although standing watch alone on the wall for 3 days was a dangerous job, it was not without its rewards. Specifically, a 7-day period after the shift in which they can relax, unless an emergency occurs. Right. Say thanks to Levy for me. Thal said, remembering his partner's wife waiting for him at home. She was the one who had sent them their rations for the days that they were stuck on the wall, so he wanted to make sure she knew he appreciated it. Will do. Try to keep out of trouble. Thal's partner said, waving to him wearily as he began moving back towards his home. As for Thal himself, he grabbed a nearby broom and began helping the residents sweep up the mess left by the turtle tide. It took nearly a week before he saw the Wanderer jail again, having nearly forgotten about him. When he did see him again, he had a tired expression on his face, as if he had gone through several sleepless nights in order to prepare himself. Meanwhile, the mad Rinnan stood next to him with a beaming smile, practically glowing as the two walked towards the outer walls. This was her 6th attempt at creating a protective ward for the city, and the residents had long since grown tired of her antics. While they wouldn't actively stop her, they would also not give her any help, and she would be strictly punished for any mishaps that occurred. She was still working off her debt from her last ward. Yet, this time it was not Rinnan who was carving the wards into the walls, but Jael. Despite his apparent tired state, he took his time carving one ward after another, evenly spaced along the walls. When each one was done, he would take a few steps back and look at it, before nodding to himself and moving on to the next. The entire process took him 2 days, even when he made himself work through the night. Thal had to admit that his dedication and perseverance were worthy of praise, but also lowered his impression of Rinnan another level. After all, if not for her standing behind him, watching the entire time with that smile, would Jael have really put himself through that? It was late into the 2nd day when he finished the last ward, and anyone could tell that he was barely able to keep himself on his feet by that point. Several of the residents had offered him food and drink as they saw him stumbling down the road, yet he ignored them all. Nobody seemed to mind, not because they felt he was doing it on purpose, but most simply thought he was too tired to even notice the people around him. The last that Thal saw of Jael was when he returned to Rinnan's house. No doubt, he had left the city early the next day, after he had some proper sleep. It must have simply been before Thal returned to duty. Even though it was widely accepted that he left early in the day, nobody could actually remember seeing him leave. Thal had invited himself over to Rinnan's home in order to check her ward, and confirmed that he had left, so he decided to believe the rumor that had been accepted. Nobody would really know what became of Jael, the researcher who would soon be known to the entire kingdom. Chapter 96. universally bad naming sense. After returning to the admin room, I collapsed in bed and slept for, I don't even know how long. Although I could technically go without sleep, and my mind was adjusting to that, that only applied to the admin room. When it comes to being immortal, my body still definitely needed rest, which was something I had learned the hard way. After waking up, I dragged myself over to the computer, and saw a blinking message, showing that someone had tried to send me a conversation request. Likely, it was while I was unavailable. Shaking my head, I opened the message to see what they wanted. There was really only one person that would message me out of the blue like that. Alcahest. Hey, Dale. Just wanted to send you a tip to let you know that there won't be a meeting this month. It's the official annual meeting, and Earth hasn't been listed in the games yet. I had almost forgotten about the Keeper meetings, but either way, this didn't bother me. This gave me plenty of time to figure out what I was doing on my own world before worrying about somebody else's. Speaking of my world, Terra. I thought inwardly, too tired to try to figure out where I had left the communication paper. Hopefully, my mind was too worn out to send the loud messages that they had been worried about before. Dale. A reply came shortly after, though not from Terra. Baihena's questioning tone told me everything I needed to know. Wrong number, but I'll send her your way. Thanks. It was probably easier to talk in person than over the thought chat radio or whatever we were calling it now. So, I turned to face the door, slouched over and propping myself up by my elbows until Terra came into the room. Hey, Dale. See, you finally decided to wake up. She said with a toothy grin, her tail wrapped around her waist like a belt. Currently, she seemed to be wearing a dress woven out of golden silk. So, what's up? Not going to ask how long I was out. I began, not even wanting to know. But, I've got a question, and it is semi-urgent. What would a child be like if their parents were a descended keeper and a god's avatar? Terra had a knowing smile on her face as she listened to that. You mean you and Ryan? She wouldn't stop talking about it while you were asleep. And, normally, there might not be that much difference. Maybe a slight increase in talent. However, things are a bit different for you, since you have the God King achievement. Oh, you don't mean. I turned my head to look at the computer, and opened up the notifications. Congratulations. You have earned a new achievement. For bestowing the bloodline of the gods upon the mortal world, you have received the Demigod's Descent achievement. Plus 20 points. I created a demigod. I asked, placing my face into my palm. Okay. What's going to happen now with it? Well, Tribal's demigods didn't really do anything special. He was mating with the variant centaurs enough to almost single-handedly run their entire species. However, really things are a bit random. Most likely, they will be born with the protagonist aura, and will be successful at whatever they seek to accomplish in life. There is a very rare chance that the divinity in their blood grants them an extra power, but so far that hasn't happened yet in your world. She explained patiently. It was only at this moment that I realized that Tribal had indeed made plenty of holy babies. And yet I had never received this achievement before. So I had to do it myself, huh? Well, what about normal children? Between your incarnations and mortals. Baihena's son didn't show any special talents, so I would say that the connection is weak enough for it not to affect the child. She said with a shrug, walking over to sit down at the bed. However, as the God King, you are a different story. In order to not create a demigod, you would need to completely cut yourself off from your keeper powers while you are in the act. And lately, you've been keeping your keeper health and stamina active. Not at all a bad decision, and it'll probably save your life later, but it also means you make god babies. She sounded just a bit too amused with that last part. I couldn't help but lift my head up to look at her curiously. You seem oddly okay with this. I thought you would be a bit more upset that I made Ryan pregnant. After all, she had been fairly hesitant towards my initial goal of a heavenly harem, not that I really see them like that anymore. I've said it before. Ryan's fine. Most of the girls up here are. If I had to list two girls as off limits, Orivy and Udona. She nodded her head confidently. Orivy, because the whole sister dynamic. And Udona, because of her memories. Like you've learned yourself, the memories and personalities of the gods and goddesses you create aren't always how you would imagine. It'd create a giant mess if you just went around sleeping with them before even confirming what kind of person they were, right? I still can't help but think that there is something else going on with this. You already gave Ryan a punishment, didn't you? First of all, you forgot to turn off the mental communication. She said with a bitter smile. And, I may have paid her a visit. But I didn't do anything drastic. Called it. Okay. Well, you can tell Orivy that I'll head down to visit you two next. Though, not to make more demigods. I just need a bit of time to check up on the world, and get over my previous descent. It had lasted quite a bit longer than I had originally planned. Tara nodded her head with a grin, not even waiting before she turned around and headed out the door, no doubt seeking out Orivy to let her know what I just said. Shaking my head with a sigh, I turned myself back around to face the computer, checking to see if anything interesting was happening in the mortal world. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore underscore. Deep within the village of the hidden fog, one particular beastkin was attempting a new technique he had been working on. Before him sat several bars of precious copper. This was a metal that the village had found hidden deposits of this material within the forest. After a few years of study, it was found possibly to melt a certain part of the metal from the ore and separate it through the use of various techniques. After that, naturally people had begun reshaping the metal into more deadly shapes, such as arrowheads or daggers. However, Phila had another idea. An idea to create a weapon more deadly than the dagger, more accurate than an arrow, and perfectly suited to their abilities. His hands quickly came together, forming various shapes as he channeled his chakra into them. Each sign seemed to resonate with his chakra, until he held the final sign as a circle with his thumbs and index fingers connecting, his other fingers all spread out. Under his breath, he recited the name of the technique in order to help him focus his chakra further. Metal melting. As his chakra poured into the copper bars in front of him, they gradually turned red, showing signs of melting. In order to prevent an accident, he willed his chakra to lift the metal into the air before him, watching as it gradually formed into a single blob of amorphous copper. Clapping his hands together, the blob trembled as it was compressed slightly. Lifting his hands, he once again made a circle with his fingers, before pulling his hands apart. In response, the copper formed into the shape of a small circle and began expanding, leaving a wide hole in the middle. Already, he could see the effects from his previous technique wearing off, the metal starting to cool and harden again. However, he wasn't done yet. He clapped his hands together again, this time with both palms facing him, one hand slapping the other. Again, the metal compressed. And again, he clapped. With every clap, it was as if the metal was being struck by a hammer, suspended in midair and gradually cooling. One clap after another seemed to strike at the circle of metal, until the outer edge resembled a thin blade. Satisfied with this result, he lifted his hands back up, forming another circle facing the metal, and moved his hands over to the side, lowering them down. The circle of metal followed the movement, lowering itself into a pot of fresh red blood. This was the blood of the shadow wolf, a beast the village had discovered over a century ago to be capable of using chakra. And it was also the key ingredient in this forging, used to temper the weapon that Phila wanted to make. He watched the steam rising from the pot of blood, bubbles rising up as it began to boil. When he lifted his hands back up, he caused the circle of metal to fly into the air and land on the table, right where the original bars had been located. By now, his ki and mana were almost exhausted, leaving him unable to continue to the final step. Thankfully, he had been expecting that, and grabbed 2 glass potion bottles from nearby, one blue and the other green. One after the other, he chugged them down without hesitation, allowing his energy to refill slightly. The village's alchemists had not found a way to completely restore someone's mana and ki, but their potions would restore a significant portion. Taking a moment to let the potions take effect, he once again began the hand signs. At first, they seemed to be identical to the ones he had performed before, except for the very last one. This time, his final hand sign was a one-handed circle with his thumb and index finger, his other fingers extended together. Metal engraving. After saying that, he lowered his fingers down towards the cooling metal, keeping them several inches from its surface. Once a few seconds had passed, a red dot formed in the metal, which followed the movements of his fingers as he began to etch in complicated symbols, those which they had found most useful in storing ki. At a glance, they looked like the components in spell diagrams, except that their shapes were less rigid, more natural. When Phila had completely engraved both sides with those symbols, he let out a deep breath, sending the disc of metal to cool in the blood once again. Afterwards, he carefully wiped it down with a cloth, smiling at his creation. A completely circular blade, made to be wielded either by hand or thrown. But, more importantly, if Phila's theory was right, it should easily be able to hold chakra, allowing it to be controlled remotely. After pouring a bit of chakra into the blade, he caused it to rise into the air with more ease than he had its previous raw form. With a thought, It began spinning rapidly, the sound of it cutting the air almost audible. Phila glanced down to his stone table and flicked his finger, causing the weapon to fly down at it, piercing halfway into the stone before stopping. With a satisfied nod, he spoke as if talking to his new creation. I will call you Chakram. The weapon made for chakra. He knew that, once he shared this weapon and its forging process with the rest of the village, it would usher in a new age for them. Although they would need to learn how to properly wield this weapon, it should drastically increase the fighting potential of any single ninja. Still, Phila had no idea how happy his actions were making a certain pair of ninja-loving goddesses, who had chosen to watch over his actions with high hopes in their heart. They had not influenced him in any way, and yet he had created a weapon that they had been looking forward to for quite a while. Chapter 97. Watching the world's turn. Huh. I never figured refining could be done like that. I thought to myself as I watched the scene of the felon man creating a chakram. Though, I inevitably facepalmed when I realized the relationship between the name and its purpose. At least I'm not the only one with a bad naming sense around here. From what I could see, the legacy class system was starting to be put to good use. As evidence of that, the felon ninja that had invented the chakram actually possessed a class known as Ninja Craftsman. When I looked at the class details, I actually discovered something rather interesting. It seemed that the system had added an unintentional hidden feature in the legacy classes, or maybe it was just how it was worded, but as the keeper I was able to see the list of skills recorded for the class. For this particular class, the skills were Metal Melting Seal, Metal Engraving Seal, Talisman Script and Talisman Bind. 3 of these skills I had just witnessed the man using personally, assuming that the Talisman Script explained the symbols he engraved on the chakram. As for the last one, I focused on the binding skill, and a short written description appeared, likely written by the progenitor of the class. This skill enables one to bind a half-completed chakra technique into a talisman, to be activated when given the proper signal. Okay, the legacy class system ended up being way more useful for me than I expected. If I'm reading this right, I will have access to the written logs of any legacy class one identify. I'll still need to train the skills myself, but this changes things from blind study to giving me a brief guide. And, having that little bit of a guide could bring quite a lot of help in the future. I made a mental note to start looking for interesting legacy classes later on, once the system became more widespread. For now, it seemed to still be a fairly rarely used system. Once more people discover it, and it becomes common knowledge, it'll probably be used a lot. Nodding my head, I moved on to the next order of business. Which was, do I really have anything that needs my immediate attention? I glanced through the world again, and aside from a couple of mundane wars fought over territory, or people catching up to the Metal Age, there actually didn't seem to be much new going on. It was at that moment that I remembered the existence of the Heroks, and went in to check on them. They're still living in caves. At least they seemed to have fire, but there honestly wasn't much more to their civilization yet beyond that. I wonder how far behind in terms of civilization the absence of a god will leave them. Then again, they also had a much later start to begin with. I gave it some thought, and decided to check in on them again after my next major fast forward. I hadn't checked on the underworld in a while. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore underscore. Within the underworld, a significant change had spread throughout the last several hundred years. This all started when the governor of the Fallen stepped down, choosing to hand his position over to a high-ranking diva official. Before that, many people had still stubbornly refused to follow the rules left behind by the goddess, saying that there was no reason to follow a creature that was more beast than man. Even with the various restrictions placed on those that did not follow the system, their stubborn pride had made them unrelenting. There were examples of this in almost all races, aside from the centaurs themselves. However, seeing this, the previous governor could only resign himself to handing the position over to a native of the realm. Now, Janam Tatar led the underworld. And things were different than they had been. Although some people still stubbornly resisted the system, demanding that their own races be in charge, they were by far the minority. At the same time, several new systems had been put in place under the new governor's orders. The previous Spirit Academy was now divided in two. On one side, there was the School of Thought, an academy designed to educate various students about the history of both the living world and the underworld, as well as training those who would become the Reapers. The other side was the School of War, which contained the previous Pagoda of Trials, as well as taking the liberty to train future spirit hunters. In order to be recognized as a full citizen of the underworld, it was necessary to pass the first tests of both the school of thought and the school of war, showing that someone had the basic aptitude to survive in the underworld. In order to qualify for the army of souls, one must pass the third test of at least one school. Most people chose not to join the army, as it was possible to live a long and simple life even without doing so. Given the very nature of the world, currency posed very little value, so they would not be forced to work for a living. However, if they wanted anything extravagant, they would need to barter. And in order to have anything worth bartering, having either more power or a higher education was needed. Yet, the highest level anyone had ever reached in the School of War was the 12th floor. Within the 12th floor, truly terrifying monsters resided. Some were almost big enough to swallow up an entire city, while others possessed slim and nimble bodies. At this time, someone was challenging that very floor. From his outer appearance, he seemed to be a human, but right now his eyes were pitch black. His body was covered with an ornate golden armor, while in his hands a pair of glistening swords were held. This man was once known as Nos Flem, a member of the Order Wraith which watched over the safety of the human continent. With his former talent as a spirit tamer and spirit hunter, it was easy for him to move up in the ranks, gathering stronger and stronger powers. He had even returned to Earth in the regular patrols, all for the sake of his desire to grow. After dying over 100 years ago, Nos had long since hit the apex of power, but was never satisfied. In his mind, there was always something greater. This very building he was in served as proof of that. Bene, Chara, let's go. He spoke aloud, and his two swords hummed in approval. The true form of these blades were companions that Nos had known in life, as they too had been wraiths with him. Yet, due to the constant warring of the humans, their lives had been cut short. Before their spirits could pass on, they met Nos, and asked him to bind them to him. In their minds, their duties were not yet done. Not so long as the spirits still threatened the land. Like this, Nos realized the greatest power of the spirit hunter, a power which could be achieved only when one received the soul of a powerful person. While his armor was formed from a simple lion, his two swords were able to release immense power. It did not take long for Nos to find his enemy for this floor. The one he encountered was of the giant type, which suited him. Fine. It was a towering behemoth, likely to be even larger than the pagoda itself if placed outside. And though it had a vaguely human shape, its skin squirmed with every movement. Aside from a giant mouth in place of where its stomach should have been, there were no real identifying features to it. Yet still, the moment Nos found it, the creature seemed to react as if it had seen him. Slowly, its hulking legs moved forward, bringing it closer and closer to Nos with every step. Seeing this, Nos chose to simply remain where he was, the grip on his swords tightening further. When the creature was just before him, it decided to go with the tried and true method of killing anything smaller than one's foot, by stepping on him. Nos watched as the giant squirming blob of a leg descended towards him, and two faint figures appeared behind him. These were the true forms of his swords, which could only appear when he used their powers. A flash of light struck through the skies, cleaving through the leg that had been descending. Nos's two swords were now respectively coated in light and shadow. While the blade of light severed all spirits in his path, the blade of darkness slashed out. Where it passed, the other leg of the giant monster seemed to be erased, causing it to fall back with a shout that echoed through the pagoda. Not missing his chance, Nos ran forward, slashing out with light and darkness together. Though this consumed a great deal of spiritual energy, this was a benefit of a spirit tamer, as their contracted spirits could pay the price for them. While he cut his way towards the belly of the beast, the hulking creature seemed to explode into scattered shards of flesh, which quickly reformed in the distance. This time, he was much smaller than his previous appearance, but the mouth looked more vicious. When the mouth opened, a jet black beam of energy shot out, and Nos thought for a moment that he heard the screams of fallen souls within the attack. This was an attack which most spiritual monsters could use, to a varying degree. Even so, it was rarely seen, as it required them to spend the souls of those they had devoured to launch it. 500, maybe 6. Nos thought out loud as he watched the beam coming towards him, estimating how many souls the creature had just consumed. He knew that he had no chance of blocking such a blast, even with his manifested armor. After slashing out once each with the swords of light and darkness, he ran to the side, avoiding the blast altogether while circling closer to his opponent. When the creature saw that its attack had been delayed by the blasts of light and shadow, it hesitated to launch another. The toll of the first blast was already starting to show, its size beginning to decrease again. In the end, It decided to end the battle with its overwhelming strength, charging into meet Nos head on. Did it forget that I already cut off its legs once? Nos thought to himself, recalling just how dumb these spirits tended to be. Only the smaller ones showed any real intelligence, so he was happy to face a brute. When the two met again, the victor was already determined as Nos carved his way through the creature's core. This made him the first person in history to complete the 12th level. Yet, he was not arrogant enough to immediately charge into the 13th. His swords had used up most of their energy, and would need to recharge for several days before he could fight like that again. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore underscore. Okay, I guess that counts as interesting. I muttered to myself, watching the scene between the human and the spirit monster. Considering that the one he fought was just over level 200, that's a pretty good result. Even at max level, that left him over 50 levels below his enemy. Still, I doubted he'd be able to last long against the Chimera souls on the 13th floor. Looking around the rest of the underworld, I found that it had undergone another expansion. Cities were now closer together, and more abundant than they had been before. This was likely a result of various powerful spirits setting up their own territories within the underworld, and inhabitants naturally gathering around them. Not everyone had the willpower to create an entire home out of smoke, after all. Is there anything else? I thought as I looked around the various areas of the world, before deciding I was done for now. I guess I can go let Terra and or Ivy know that I'll be down soon. I could feel a small smile on my lips as I thought about visiting the two of them. Chapter 98. Need more. I was just getting ready to set up my body for descending to the mortal world again, when the door burst open, and a tiny missile came flying in my direction. Dale. Or Ivy shouted out as she wrapped her arms around my neck. Big Sis said you were finally ready to come down and visit us. I chuckled as I heard that, nodding my head. That's right. I was just setting everything up right now to do that. Or Ivy smiled happily as she heard that, her eyes becoming upturned crescents. Finally, Tilda. But, could you fast forward by about 2 days, first? She asked, and I really didn't see a reason to refuse, although I was curious. Is something happening in 2 days? I felt my eyebrow quirking up as I asked that. It's a surprise. She let out a small giggle as she said that, finally pulling her arms off of me. The two of us are staying in the city of Heldar in the kingdom Udonia. Once you head down, we'll meet you in front of the southern gate. Okay. Anything else I should know, or should I make a reputation for myself before I head down? I questioned, seeing as how they seemed to have a fairly specific plan for how we were going to spend our time. Or Ivy tilted her head, seeming to consider the question seriously, before closing her eyes and shaking her head rapidly. Nope. Blank slate should be just fine. She assured me. Nodding my head, I turned back to the computer, and fast-forwarded 2 days as I had been requested. It was such a small leap that it barely even counted for anything, so I didn't mind at all. As for the city that she requested, I did a brief search, and found that it was the capital of Udonia. Guessing there is something fairly big happening today. Seeing as I knew where I was going now, I went ahead and returned to working on the body I would use to descend. Since I was going to Udonia, a kitsune should do just fine. For hair color, let's go with a dark red. Otherwise, I kept most of my features in line with my normal body. Now, a name, I'm not really going down there to do anything major this time, so just calling myself Mitchell would work just fine. I nodded my head, before finalizing the decision. Body verified. Kitsune race selected. Beginning descent. May you work for the betterment of your world, Keeper. I felt the blue lights envelop me, causing me to close my eyes as I descended into the world. Naturally, I didn't forget to grab my storage bag, as I never go anywhere anymore without it. When I arrived, I was in a small forest just off the dirt path leading to the city. I wanted to give myself a good bit of distance from anyone else that might spot my arrival, and thankfully this area was clear of any beastkin. Moving onto the dirt road, I set my destination for the nearby city. From this distance, I could see a rough outline of the architecture involved. The city's outer walls, like so many others, appeared to have been created by a group of druids. This caused it to appear as a single, smooth surface rather than a pile of stone bricks. One thing I noticed that was different from Cowbunga's walls was the addition of parapets, small sections of raised stone placed regularly along the top of the wall. This actually confused me for a moment, as that was typically used as a defense in times of war. While they didn't exactly go away during peace times, part of me questioned why they were even there in the first place. Perhaps it is for the guards to better shoot down attacking monsters. I briefly considered that idea, nodding my head. Unsurprisingly, the wall did not appear to have any kind of ward that I could make out from this distance. Ryan said that wards were a relatively uncharted field of magic, so I wasn't really expecting to find them commonly on cities for at least a few hundred years. Contrary to the stone wall, there was a large wooden gate that stood wide open where the dirt path met the wall. Beyond the gate, I saw several small buildings. Unlike the elven city I had recently visited, the buildings of Heldar appeared to be constructed of wood instead of stone. I could see several window holes in the sides of buildings, but there was no glass being used in this region. No guard attempted to stop me as I entered the city, although there was one posted just outside the gate, and another atop the walls. The one on the ground, an Ursa man with strong features, even greeted me with a smile and a nod. Within the city, I could hear a multitude of voices talking merrily. From the information I saw about the city before descending, roughly 10,000 beastkin lived here. Judging by the size of the place, that seemed to be an accurate estimation. Although there were not very many homes with multiple floors, there were long roads with buildings on either side. I had even seen branching dirt paths on the way in, which seemed to lead to farmland outside of the city's walls. Over here, a voice suddenly called out to me, and I turned my head, finding a pair of beautiful young women running towards me. The two seemed to be almost identical in their appearance, both just shy of 5.5 feet, looking to be in their later teens or early 20s. Their bodies were well proportioned, and they each had dog tails swaying behind them, as well as large furred ears atop their heads. The only difference was that one had silver hair and wore a black dress, while the other had black hair and wore a silver dress. Name, please, if you would. I heard Orivy's excited voice calling into my mind, and readily answered that I would be going by Mitchell. As soon as I did, the silver-haired sister ran up and took my hand, dragging me towards the other one. You finally made it, Mitchell. We've been waiting for you. Okay. So silver hair is Orivy, and black hair is Tara. As I thought that, I looked towards the black-haired sister, seeing an almost goofy smile that I hadn't seen on the felon goddess in so long. Sorry to keep you waiting. So, what's the big event? I asked, nodding my head towards the direction of the city center, where I could hear more voices speaking loudly. Every now and then we would see someone walking out of their homes and heading in that direction, as if it were only natural. Tara's incarnation spoke up without a second thought. It's the weekly festival of Dakar, the day of rest and celebration. She said as she grabbed my free hand. Come on, Murren and I can show you. Okay. So Orivy is Murren. Now, would someone do a convenient name drop for Tara's incarnation? It would be much appreciated. As I thought that, I nodded my head towards the two of them, causing Murren to laugh. Come on, Rin, let's hurry up or we'll miss the fun. And Rivy comes in for the save. So, what is Dakar to celebrate, anyways? I tried to use the language knowledge granted to me by the system, but the word did not seem to have any direct translations. Thankfully, Murren answered my question pretty regularly. It's the day that the four goddesses created the four kingdoms. It is said that they communed with their priests for 6 days and nights to set up the land and structure of the kingdoms. On the 7th day, they went silent, allowing their people time to rest. Yet at the same time, it was a time of celebration, because the four kingdoms were still united. I couldn't help but glance over to Rin as I heard that, recalling the version of history that Tara had told me before. She shook her head, smiling knowingly. The goddesses work in mysterious ways. Sometimes without ever actually doing any work at all, yet people still perceive it as so. Or, maybe they just wanted a convenient excuse. That is, sadly, true. Saying that it was the idea of the goddesses themselves to divide the kingdom gives a perfect reason to keep the church in the highest position of power. As we turned a corner, I saw a pair of felon children running past us, each with a ribbon on their arm. One of the ribbons was white, while the other was brown. It looked like they were being chased, so I turned my attention towards the larger group of kids running after them. They all had playful smiles, so it didn't seem to be bullying. And again, there were ribbons on the arms of each child. Though, the ribbons on those kids were all blue. And, what is that? Murren looked between the two groups of kids, covering her mouth to suppress a laugh. Oh, this'll be good, that is the Goddess's Keeper game that they play every Dakar. Explanation needed. Seeing the stiff look on my face, the two sisters looked at each other with satisfied smiles, before Rin took over. There is a legend of a being who stands above the goddesses, someone who is faceless and formless, yet can alter the very world itself with a thought. Some people call him the Father, some people call him the Maker, but the common term that has developed is that he is the one who protects us, keeps our world safe. So, he has come to be known as the goddess's keeper. Giggling, Murren took over from there, and we could see more children walking around with blue ribbons, as if searching for someone. When the festival of Dakar first began, a bunch of kids decided to make a game of the legend. Everyone involved is given a single ribbon to wrap around their arm. Blue ribbons indicate the mortals, who worship the goddesses. Most kids have a blue ribbon, but there are 4 special ones. The white ribbon marks Udona, brown marks Calliope, black marks Acalia, and red marks Terra. If anyone with a blue ribbon catches one of the goddesses, they exchange ribbons. Rin couldn't suppress the grin on her face as Murren explained the rules of the game, and I knew there was more. However, among the blue ribbons, there is one special one. On the inside of one of them, there will be a golden band. That person becomes the goddess's keeper. In order to W in the game, you have to have either one of the goddess ribbons, or the keeper ribbon by the time the game ends in the evening. My life has turned into a children's game of tag. There aren't any other similar games, are there? I couldn't help but ask, looking between the two as they burst out laughing. No, playing that keeps them pretty busy. Some kids play other games among themselves, but most either stick with this game, or help out the adults. Rin explained with a shrug of her shoulders, still grinning happily. What about security? Monsters won't just stop attacking once a week. Because of the festival, will they? I mean, if anything they should be attacking in greater numbers, because all of the juicy targets are in the city. Rin nodded her head, as if understanding the question. For safety, there are patrols going through the nearby area every day, including Dakar. While it means some people don't get to enjoy the festivities, they rotate them regularly so that nobody is completely left out. I see. So, aside from this game, what else is there to do on Dakar? Surely, the two of you didn't ask me to delay my arrival just for that. Though, I could completely see Terra doing it just to mess with me. But, I couldn't see Oribe doing that. Murren grinned slightly, and we finally got to what seemed to be the largest building in the city. This is the theater. Every Dakar, there are performances held here. We wanted to bring you here to watch those, Tilda. She assured, winking playfully to me as she finally let go of my hand. Rin soon joined her, and the two ran straight towards the theater, right past a line of people who were waiting for admittance. Oh, great, they're performers. Though, seeing them running like that did answer a small question I had been wondering about regarding beastkin fashion. Apparently, their dresses were cut just above where the base of their tails were, giving a brief glimpse of skin before pants covered everything below the tail. Still, very pretty. Chapter 99. Alternative Facts. The theater itself seemed to be the only multi-story building in the entire city, consisting of a total of 3 floors. Each floor formed an overhang that cast shade over the floor below it, yet at the same time created a nice architectural design. Once the line progressed and I was allowed in, I was guided up to the 3rd floor, where a vast majority of the seating was held. Looking at the rest of the audience, I couldn't make out any kind of racial discrimination, as everyone was here in seemingly equal numbers. Though, it seemed like there might be more kitsune, but that was entirely likely since this was Udonia. Down below, I saw the stage, surrounded on almost all sides by the audience with only its back free. On the stage, I saw 15 women, each holding a long, thin stick. At the end of each stick was a bundle of ribbon arranged like a flower, with various colors present among them. Among the women, I noticed Murren and Rin standing near the back, with Murren holding a black flower ribbon, and Rin a white one. Finally, a male lichen walked out, dressed in a regal white suit. As he spoke, his voice transmitted to each and every member of the audience, as if using an unseen microphone. Thank you all for attending today. For this Dakar festival, we have prepared a special treat. A very important part of our history, passed down through the generations since time immemorial. I give you all, the Spring of 4 Divines. He gave a bow towards the audience, before walking off stage, followed by all but 4 of the women, who bowed their bodies low, their ribbon batons held at a full arm's length. When the man's voice rang out again, the 4 women began moving, walking in a counterclockwise motion around the stage. I noticed that, among the 4, there was one of each type of beastkin. In the beginning, the races were naught but scattered tribes, wandering the wilderness. Gradually drifting further and further apart. As if to emphasize his words, the gap between the women became wider and wider. The goddesses, seeing our plight, sought to aid us. Not in the strength of self, but in unity. They sent their divine messages to members of different tribes to call a gathering, the first gathering in our known history. This time, the women slightly changed their pace, slowly spiraling inwards towards the center of the stage where they met up. Each one hooked their left arm in the center, grabbing the hand of the woman opposite them. Some tribesmen fought them initially, but the four messengers showed them that the bonds formed between them were stronger than that of those disparate tribes. The four women began walking in a circle again, arms still locked together. Although they sought to spread the message of love, they were not above the use of force to defend that bond. Finally, with a flick of their wrists, the ribbons all unfurled. The colors of the ribbons were the same as with the keeper game outside: white, black, brown, and red. They raised the ribbons above their heads, letting them form a connected circle that surrounded the four of them. Through their combined efforts, the first city was formed, which would later be known as Terraria. The four women broke apart, spinning on their feet as they moved in a straight line from each other, their ribbons dancing in the air around them. The felon holding the red ribbon happened to be dancing towards the front of the stage. Yet, they needed a leader. Someone to guide their new nation. The four chose Ardra, child of Terra. She ushered in the first generation of peace. The felon woman offered a low bow, her ribbon dancing behind her, though the bow was short-lived. When she stood up again, she cartwheeled off to the side of the stage, her ribbon forming an almost perfect circle around her body. Then, one by one the other women came up and did the same. Many thought that Ardra would choose her own daughter to succeed her, as she seemed a worthy leader herself. But Ardra would not allow it. Instead, she remembered the love of her sisters, and called forth a young kitsune, Mara Eversong. Her voice ushered in the second generation. Following in this tradition, the second queen appointed the lichen child Talia Fairwind. And after her, the huntswoman Grella Stormflower. Like this, a cycle which would last countless generations began. Finally, there was nobody left on stage. Terraria grew, and every generation the torch would be passed to another race, a cycle which showed the bond between us, between the sister goddesses themselves. Yet soon, Terraria had grown too far. Following their cue, all 15 girls danced onto the stage, their ribbons flowing around them as they mingled and intertwined, yet never seemed to get in each other's way. Soon, it was not enough to have but a single kingdom. I noticed only one of the women, Rin, seemed to not be dancing, standing in the center of all others, her body often obscured as she looked around in what seemed to be panic. A single queen's reach was unable to completely grasp the land on which we roam. So once again, the sister goddesses showed their love for their people. 10 of the dancers dispersed, leaving only Murin, Rin, and 2 other women. Aside from Rin, the other 3 walked around her, her expression seeming to calm as their ribbons danced along her waist. They spoke to their priests, and delivered their divine message. Divide the kingdom, they said. Yet, the queen was afraid. Not to give up her throne, but to destroy the unity her people shared. Don't worry, they said, we shall always watch over you. The 4 dancers representing the goddesses slowly began to move away, and Rin unfurled her own white ribbon, slowly beginning to dance and twirl about. They promised her a unity even greater than before. Because, even though the kingdoms held a different banner, they were all the children of the goddesses. As the 4 goddess dancers danced off stage, 3 more came in to dance with Rin. Thus, they created Udonia, following our goddess Udona of the spring bloom. Terraria became the home of Terra of the summer harvest. They created Kelios, home to Keliope of the autumn sun. And finally, they created Akal, home to Akalia of the winter moon. The 4 dancers, representing the 4 kingdoms, gradually moved further apart. From off stage, 2 dancers went to join each kingdom, dancing and twirling about. Under the loving gaze of the 4 divines, the sister goddesses, we have continued to prosper in harmony. And, as long as we believe in them, we shall continue to do so, forevermore. Slowly, the 4 dancers began moving towards the edges of the stage, their ribbons falling lower without the constant momentum. I had to admit, the dance itself was beautiful. It may not seem like much compared to modern standards, but it had its own beauty nonetheless. Even if I knew that some of the history that they were talking about was not entirely accurate, it made for a good story. And, in time, nobody would really know the truth about it aside from me and those in the admin room. But, was it so bad to have that truth painted over the original? In a way, wasn't it a better one, one which made the people happy? I saw several people standing, so naturally I joined them. However, rather than applause, they did something unexpected. The lichens howled, leaning their heads back with their fists on their chest. The felon roared, their arms creating an X in front of them. The Ursa stamped their feet and slapped their chest once. And finally, the Kitsune clasped their hands in front of themselves and tilted their heads back, letting out a higher pitched tone than the howl of the lichens, though in shorter bursts. The combinations of different sounds, as if almost natural, created a harmony that echoed through the theater. And, while it did somewhat hurt my ears to be in the middle of it, I did appreciate how so many people were able to form a chorus like that so naturally. When the sounds finished, the performers came back to the stage and bowed to the audience in turn bowing to them. Following the shared bow, people began casually talking to their neighbors as they moved slowly towards the exits. I saw a couple of strangers seeking to start a conversation with me, but politely excused myself. At least, I hope I was polite about it. It's hard to understand the customs that quickly. No sooner had I gotten outside than I found myself being pulled to the side by Murren and Rin, who were laughing happily. So, what did you think, Mitchell? Murren asked with an excited expression. I couldn't help but smile at the two of them. You both did great. Do you two dance like that often? She nodded her head, and Rin excused herself to go fetch us a snack. Yeah, our parents said when we were younger that we should give it a try. After doing it a couple times, we decided we really liked it. We keep trying to rope the other three in, too, but they've been busy with their own projects. Murren puffed her cheeks out cutely as she said that, and I could easily make out the little halfling goddess living in that body. So, no advancing civilization, exploring new horizons, just exploring the life of a dancer. I teased lightly, earning myself another giggle from her. Yeah, that's right. I really wanted to see what it's like to live in a big city like this, and Rin wanted to get away from the fighting for a while. She nodded her head quickly, moving off to the side of the dirt road to let other people pass. Soon, Rin came back holding a large wooden tray, atop which were 3 pots of soup. Soup's on, she said with a laugh, and we each took one of the bowls. In each was a carved wooden spoon, the soup itself being mostly broth with a bit of meat and vegetables. So, Mitchell, you going to stick around for the rest of the festival? She asked as she looked over towards me. There's more, I asked in mild surprise. After the dance and the game they showed me earlier, I didn't know what more to expect from a weekly festival like this. Of course there is, she laughed, while Murren began to happily enjoy her soup, letting out delighted noises with every spoonful. Later on, they'll be drinking. And every week, there are taverns that try out new dishes to get people's opinions for new recipes. Today's soup is actually a new experiment from one of them. It's really good, Murren assured us, her mouth still mostly full. Curious, I took a spoonful of the soup. At first, it seemed somewhat spicy, but then that taste seemed to be washed away when I bit into some of the meat. Juicy and savory, it almost literally melted in my mouth. I had to admit that this was tastier than a lot of meals I had back before the whole keeper business. It actually is pretty good, I said with just a bit of surprise. I honestly hadn't expected a meal cooked in this time period to really taste good to someone with a more modern palate. I suppose I could stay for a few hours, I answered with mock reluctance. I was actually quite curious to see what else this place had to offer. If it weren't so dirty, I might actually consider living here myself for a few years. However, it wasn't really at the level I'd find livable yet. Awesome. Murren nodded as she heard that. But, what do you do for currency? I couldn't help but ask that. It hasn't been long enough since metalworking became a thing for the Beastkin that they would have a currency such as silver and gold. Barter. Mostly, Rin answered, shrugging her shoulders. For small trades like these bowls of soup, it's generally fine as long as we return the bowls. Sometimes people offer livestock, food, or even precious gems in trade. What? Like diamonds and rubies? I asked, surprised that such items are casually tossed around in barters. Sometimes, she confirmed, nodding her head, before taking a spoonful of her own soup and letting out a happy groan. Definitely telling him to keep this recipe. But yeah, unless the gem is more than a few centimeters, or is exceptionally pure, it won't go for much in a trade. You might be able to get a single bajan, a weird type of 3-horned cow, or a quality weapon for it. Though, quality by current standards. Yeah, I doubt there'll be anything to replace my sword for a long time. I nodded my head, sipping my way through my soup until there was none left, before putting my bowl back on the tray. Alright, what's next? Chapter 100. Daka Shah. After sampling the Beastkin food, we moved on to the next bit of entertainment. that the Dakar had to offer. Ooh, I'm surprised that they are doing this week. Rin said in an excited tone as she pulled us along towards a crowd of people that were letting out cheers and shouts. Seeing as we could barely hear each other over the volume, and couldn't talk about some things openly, Tara sent me a message using her God voice. This is the Dakar Shah, a fight that happens whenever someone wants to challenge the Shirai, or reigning champion. As I listened to her explanation, we finally pushed our way through to the front row of the crowd. In front of us, there was a kitsune and an ursa, both male. The ursa had leather straps wrapped around his wrists, while the kitsune was wielding a long wooden staff. He is Fenric, the current Shirai. He's managed to hold the title for nearly a year now. I heard her telling me as I looked towards the kitsune. Just then, the larger ursa charged forward, using his superior size and strength to try to overwhelm Fenric. Oddly, I noticed his footwork seemed very practiced, and he kept himself controlled far better than I would expect a fighter in this age. No doubt, he was a martial artist practicing the techniques that Kellyoke brought down with her. At the last second before reaching Fenric, he planted one foot into the ground and struck out with an open palm. The strength behind the strike was enough that I could begin to see the air distort slightly around it. Yet, its speed was nothing much. Fenric nimbly dodged to the side, before planting one end of his staff into the ground and using it to vault into the air. Once airborne, Fenric did a quick flip, and brought the staff back around to slam against his challenger's head. Judging by the fact that the staff didn't break, despite the resounding crack that the impact caused, there is no doubt he infused it with ki to strengthen it. As for the poor ursa that was the victim of the attack, his body froze for several long moments while Fenric landed, before slowly collapsing to the ground. His health bar had dropped down near the very bottom, showing just how much damage he had taken in that attack, while Fenric's hadn't even seemed to drop at all. Cheers and boos rang out from the gathered crowd as the fight came to an end, until Fenric once again planted his staff into the ground, quieting everyone. Is there anyone else who wants to challenge me? He asked in a calm tone, scanning the crowd with his eyes. I saw his gaze linger at me, surrounded by Murin and Rin, before moving on. Oh, goddess of fate, just what are the benefits of being Shirai? I couldn't help but ask inwardly, knowing my prayer would get through. The Shirai is captain of the city's guards, and gets a level of respect to go with it. She answered, though I noticed a bit of annoyance in Tara's tone. He's been trying to get with us for months now, flaunting his authority and wanting to make our incarnations his women. I'm surprised he hasn't been able to, honestly. I mean, neither of the two sisters seemed built for fighting, and I wouldn't expect a society at this stage to be so strict against things like that. However, as I thought about that, the answer came to me from the heavens. Women are sacred among the Beastkin. Forcing yourself on one is a crime met with immediate execution. He wants to, but he knows that he wouldn't be able to get away with it. Ah, that did explain some things. The four deities of the Beastkin were all women, so it is natural that women have a high standing in society. You there. I suddenly heard a voice calling out to me, breaking me out of my mental conversation. Glancing around, I found Fenric had directed his gaze at me again, and it was not at all friendly. Perhaps you wish to challenge. I definitely do not wish to do so. However, before I could open my mouth to decline, Murin spoke up angrily from next to me. He's not scared of you, Fenric. You too, or Ivy. Really? I looked over to her and found her smiling back, her face flushed slightly. Well, why not prove it then? The kitsune man chuckled darkly, twirling his staff in one hand. Or does he wish to cower like a scared pup? Tara, how much of my strength can I use without causing a big incident? I asked curiously, not paying much attention to the rather obvious provocation. Turning away this fight was likely to cause problems for Murin and Rin, but at the same time I didn't want to go overboard with my Godking aura in effect. One stat at 60%, the rest sealed. Or all stats at 20%. Anything more than that, and you'll have the entire city feeling your presence. Her answer came after a brief pause, and I knit my brows together as I decided how I'd do this. Of course, the answer seemed fairly obvious after a short consideration. When he saw me stepping forward, Fenric sneered. And so, are you going to ask for a weapon? As he asked that, he held the staff in one arm behind himself diagonally, his forearm flat against it. I really didn't have enough experience with any weapon other than a sword, but I naturally couldn't use a sword in this era. I'll do this unarmed, I answered with a shake of my head, entering what even I knew to be a sloppy combat stance. Note to self, get martial arts lessons from Tara after I go back. I heard a brief chuckle before he charged forward, seeming to start the match. Inwardly, I focused on my keeper wisdom, weakening the wall around it to let roughly half of it through, and with it my ki. My body was flooded with energy by the time he reached me, to the point where I barely even noticed his initial jab with his staff. Bringing my attention back to Fenric, I saw a brief flicker of surprise cross his face before his expression became cold. Flexing his thumb, he caused the staff to shoot back towards him, and with his other arm grabbing the back of it, he whipped it around in a wide arc to bash against me like he had with the Ursa. Unfortunately for him, his actions were too slow. With my ki flooding every corner of my body, he seemed to be moving at a snail's pace. It did not take hardly any effort for me to reach up and grab the end of the approaching staff. As I suspected before, I could feel a trace of ki inside of it. Clenching my fist, I heard a small explosion as the end of the staff shattered, Fenric's face paling as he felt his ki being torn apart by an opposing force. Taking one step forward, I placed the palm of my hand against his chest, and before he could recover, I pushed. I didn't want to kill him, so I held back quite a lot of my ki from that attack, but still he went flying like a bolt from the collision. He sailed over a nearby building, and we could all hear a crash from where he landed. Unlike before, there were no cheers or booing from the crowd. Everyone seemed to grow silent as they stared at the spot where Fenric had stood a moment ago. However, the silence was broken by two howls that rang out in unison. I turned and saw the two sister goddesses, each with a hand to her chest while her head was tilted back. With them as the trigger, other howls soon rang out, followed by the familiar chorus that I heard in the theater before, though this time I stood at the center of it. To the new charade, one man cried out after the applause had ended, his voice echoed by countless others. I could only shake my head, raising a hand to silence them. I am a traveler passing through. I cannot be your charade, I explained, restraining my keeper wisdom once again to return me to normal levels. It would have been nice to fight him normally, but I doubted that he was below level 100, and likely had almost all of his levels in combat classes. Murren and Rin stepped forward with wide smiles on their faces. Sorry, Garn, Mitchell's right. He just came this week to visit us for this Dakar, and is leaving to go home soon. Rin explained, reaching down to hold my hand as she did. The lichen man who had started the previous shout shook his head with a sigh. Nothing we can do about it, then. Still, it was nice to see someone knock Fenric on his ass for once. With that, there was a series of laughter in the crowd as numerous people agreed with his statement. Yeah, believe me, I agree, Rin said, a knowing smile on her face. Anyways, it looks like this Shaw is over now. Someone might want to call for a healer for Fenric. It sounded like he landed in the stable. You have your stables this far inside the city. Another roar of laughter rang out as Murren and Rin dragged me back into the streets. Thankfully, nobody seemed to follow us after that, and the crowd began to disperse. Phew, I was worried for a minute there. Murren said with a small grin. I guess this is the part where you go back, huh? I thought about it for a moment, glancing between the two of them. Are there any more sights for me to see before I go? While I wanted to keep a low profile, I had spent so long keeping Ryon's incarnation company, the least I could do was see these two for the rest of the day, right? Hearing my question, the expressions of both sisters brightened at once. With a happy laugh, they began dragging me around town once again. We spent the rest of the day running from one area of the city to the next, trying everything from alcohol to the latest fashion. Of course, we didn't have much to barter with, so we mostly stuck to the free samples, but still. That night, after everything calmed down and people were beginning to return to their homes, I decided to do the same thing. Once I was secluded in an empty corner hidden behind a building, I returned to the admin room. I felt my mind clearing instantly from the remnants of the booze I had consumed, and found myself immediately tackled by a small projectile halfling. Thank you so much, I had so much fun today, Orivy said with a wide smile as she wrapped her arms around me, almost knocking me to the floor. I gave a small chuckle as I reached down, patting her head. I had fun, too, Orivy. Though maybe next time, try not to get me into a fight. I scolded her with a teasing tone. Ah, but that jerk totally had it coming to him. Besides, I knew nothing would really happen to you. If he tried anything dirty, Big Sis would have killed him on the spot. Although she had a bright smile as she said that, I noticed some rather scary words mixed in there. Just, what levels do your incarnations have? I couldn't help but ask that, noticing how easy she seemed to believe Terra could have killed Fenric in the middle of a big fight like that. I'm a bit behind. I've got 38 in monk, 16 in martial artist, 5 for scholar, and 20 for bard. Tara has 50 in assassin, 10 in bard, 20 for monk, 10 in mage, and almost 60 in rogue tilde. Since she's not really learning anything new, she can't get the scholar class, so she devoted her levels to more practical classes. Those aren't practical classes, or Ivy. She's a blade dancer. I wanted to retort that, but couldn't. I mean, it's not surprising that Tara was able to get those kinds of levels. Even if she can only use the knowledge known by the inhabitants, that still means that she knows how to train every class up to the limits it's been trained so far. I can only really look at that assortment of classes as her wanting to protect Orivy. That's not to say that I won't be looking back at what Tara's done as Rin later to confirm, though. Shaking my head, I patted Orivy's hair again before looking around the room. So, where is she anyways? I asked, remembering that I still needed to learn martial arts from her. Though, if this was going to be anything like when I learned to forge, or when I learned magic, do I have to do this again? Yeah, I do. Chapter 101 Hidden Knowledge. So, you want to learn a martial art, huh? Tara asked, looking at me with an impressed smile. After coming back home, I had sought her out, remembering how she had taught Calliope a strength-based martial art. That's right. Right now, I can win with overwhelming stats, but my actual ability is still lacking. So, I need a martial art that will fit me, and that means coming to you for help. I lowered my head respectfully, doing my best to make a good impression as I asked for the favor. No. However, the answer I received was different from my expectations. Sorry, Dale, it's not that I don't want to teach you one, but I really can't. Your style of fighting doesn't fit well with any martial arts from the last 3 worlds. You rely too heavily on the supernatural energies, which were almost entirely excluded from the worlds of those keepers. So, there's nothing you can do? I asked, looking back up at her. She seemed to have a pensive expression as she considered. I can't, but that doesn't mean you can't learn one. There's actually a really easy way for you to do so. I was just hoping not to need to tell you about it for a while. After she said that, she gave a helpless shrug, while a blue window appeared in front of me. It showed the normal market screen that I was used to, but a few search parameters had already been put in to narrow down the results. Tara, this is, I asked as I looked at a list of strangely named items. These are library's martial arts knowledge, which other keepers have submitted to the market. I went ahead and narrowed the results based on the general humanoid shape, and the energies available to your world. You won't be able to do a lot of the movements for most of these as a centaur, so pick carefully. As she said that, I was already reading through the descriptions for the first few items. Why did you want to wait before letting me see this? I couldn't help but ask again. Some of these martial arts had truly exaggerated descriptions, but I could not deny the possibility that it was more than idle boasting. Are some of them faulty goods that keepers spread out to weaken competitors or something? Huh, no, nothing like that. A malicious keeper will often do their best to help a new keeper get into the games as quickly as possible, that way they aren't prepared for what is coming, and don't have the training they need. So, if anything, the techniques and suggestions that they put out there are among the most effective to advance your world. Sure, there are a few idiots that post bad information, but if you check the forums for news on each item, you can see reviews from others that have used it. This isn't like some cheap internet forum where you can have multiple accounts to praise your own work. As she explained, she shook her head slightly. No, the reason I had wanted to wait as long as I could was because I wanted to give you a chance to discover certain things on your own. You mean? I looked at that screen again, and opened another window, typing in my own search parameters. Geometric Magic. Beginner. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the first tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 200 points. Geometric Magic. Advanced. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the second tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 600 points. Geometric Magic. Expert. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the third tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 1800 points. Geometric Magic. Master. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the fourth tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 5400 points. Geometric Magic. Grandmaster. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the fifth tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 16,200 points. Geometric Magic. Epic. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the sixth tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 48,600 points. Geometric magic. Legend. This knowledge database contains all symbols and patterns used for the final tier of geometric magic, as well as their meaning. 145,800 points. While I was amazed that this information was even available, my eyes couldn't help but drift over towards the prices. To buy the complete package, it would take well over 200,000 points. Out of curiosity, which tiers of magic has Earth discovered? I asked as I looked up to Terra, who had a knowing smile. Mostly just some of the first, while barely touching the second. Unless you include that dragon. He's quite a ways up there. She answered honestly. There's no way Ryan wouldn't have found this. No, she found it the first day. She just prefers studying the hard way. When I asked her about it, she said it's because she thinks she'll feel like she earned it more if she didn't just have you buy it. Well, that did sound like her. Okay, so you're saying that one of these martial arts should fit me more than what the previous Earths could offer? I asked one last time to confirm, looking back to the search window she had shown me. That's right. After you absorb the information, I'd suggest practicing against Keliope to test it out, and then descending to the world for a proper trial. After I heard her answer, I nodded one last time to look through the list. Honestly, there were quite a few that looked interesting to me. Yet, some stood out more than others. 1,000 arms, 10,000 threads. This system of martial arts focuses primarily on the use of chakra, and the many applications it can have in fighting. Its moveset largely consists of instantaneous movement, controlling multiple weapons, and temporary energy replicants. 150 points. Aki Seppo. This system of martial arts focuses primarily on the use of spiritual energy, and harnessing the energy of a tamed spirit within you. It guides you to choosing a powerful spirit partner, and shows various methods that will maximize your strength while using it. 125 points. Six Palms Annihilation. This system of martial arts focuses primarily on the use of ki. Contained within is a ki pathway adaptable to many existing ki networks. Although this martial arts only contains 6 techniques, each one is incredibly powerful. 75 points. Phantom Path. This system of martial arts focuses in dual parts on both mana and ki, using both in order to bring out the greatest killing power. Its moveset consists of stealth and precision striking abilities. 100 points. These 4 in particular caught my eye the most. I couldn't help but glance at my balance to confirm that I still had plenty of spare points. Though, I couldn't help but think about the assassin class when I read the description of the Phantom Path. What I remember of its techniques largely mirrored that. However, I have not been walking the path of an assassin before now, so I cast that one from my mind. As for the Six Palms Annihilation, it was actually incredibly tempting, because it seemed like it would be the simplest of the 4 to learn, while also holding a great deal of strength. However, I'd probably need a proper ki path to fully utilize it. Another quick search showed me that ki path knowledge was also purchasable, and the standard path was 100 points. That instantly made the 6 palms go from the cheapest to the most expensive of the 4. Next on the list was Aki Seppo, the only one with a non-translated name. Or maybe, the name was meant to be nonsense in the first place. I had been wanting to find information regarding better usage of spirit energy, and had only been missing a proper source. This art was definitely a strong contender. Finally, the one that really captured my eyes the most was the 1,000 arms, 10,000 threads. Out of all of the energy types I had seen so far, chakra was by far my favorite. It had the impossibility of magic, combined with the raw power of ki. The only question was, should I only get one, or both? I looked up at Tara to ask that, and she smiled. It's up to you, Dale. I can't help you decide this. You've just got to go with your gut. My gut is simple, my gut says get both. 2 martial arts means twice as many options to fight. Alright. Can you pass a message to Ryan? Tell her I want to use 275 points for a personal expense. She shouldn't have a problem with it. As for this offering a leap of power to my world, I didn't have any plans to spread it around. I might eventually give Aki Seppo to the Wraiths, in order to give their upper echelons a boost in power, but the other one should mostly remain with myself. Tara nodded her head, seeming to wait a few moments before she spoke again. She said it's fine, and just asked that you give her a little while longer before buying the information on magic. She chuckled lightly, shaking her head. She wants more time to study it herself first, before relying on points. I understand, I answered, before choosing to buy both of the martial arts. Out of curiosity, what happens to the patents a keeper has when they are defeated in a game? I mean, your records only seem to go back that far, right? So you wouldn't know which items might be listed by previous Earth keepers. As she gave her reply, two brilliant blue lights erupted between us. You mean the royalty stuff? The royalties just stop after a keeper dies in a game. The simple answer was a bit surprising, as I had imagined them transferring ownership to the keeper that defeated them. Thinking about that, I noticed the two glowing blue orbs that had taken shape in front of me. They seemed to look just like the information orbs I had received back when I bought the information on the sealing magic. So, how do I read these, and absorb the knowledge like you said? That's the easy part. Just grab one, and focus on it. Or, you can just push it into your skull, but I wouldn't suggest that because it might cause you to take in more than you can handle at once. She shrugged her shoulders lightly as she responded. Nodding my head, I gently grabbed both orbs, and prepared to go back to my room. All right, I'll let you get back to the others. When I had found her, she was socializing with Udona and Akalia, so I figured I had kept her long enough. She smiled happily, leaning in to give me a quick kiss before turning around and heading back. As for me, I just stared down at the two spheres of light as I walked back to my own room. Once I was back, I decided to start with the more immediately useful one. Sure, spiritual energy would be good to master, but I'll want to wait for a more powerful creature to be born most likely first. So, I placed the one that gave me the impression of that aside, and focused on the other. Almost immediately, information began flooding into my mind. Information about methods to utilize chakra that I had never imagined, as well as some simple training methods to help its practitioners grow in strength. I was only able to hold the connection for around a half hour before I released my focus, panting as I tried to hold in everything I had learned. So, it can be done like that, I thought to myself, giving myself just enough time to relax before I gripped the orb once again.